There's a particular kind of evening that you know very well by now. Not the dramatic kind. Not the nights where something terrible has happened and the grief sits on your chest like a stone and you know exactly why you can't sleep. This is a different kind of night, the kind where everything is technically fine, where no catastrophe has arrived, where no one has died, no disaster has knocked at your door, and yet something in you refuses to be still. Not anxiety exactly, not sadness, something quieter than both. Something like a low-frequency hum beneath the surface of your thoughts. The kind of inner noise you can only hear when everything outside has finally gone quiet. You move through mornings and messages and small decisions and conversations that meant something and conversations that meant nothing, and the spaces in between where you scrolled without knowing why. And now it's late, and now the day is over, and the movement has stopped. But the mind has not. It keeps going, replaying things you said, planning things you haven't done, worrying about versions of the future that haven't arrived and may never arrive. It circles back to the same thoughts, like a river that has carved its groove so deep it cannot help but flow there again. You've noticed this. You've noticed that your mind seems to have a life of its own, that it doesn't stop simply because you want it to. That rest, real rest, is something you have to find rather than something that simply comes. If this is where you are tonight, then you're exactly where this was made for. What you're about to hear is not a lecture. It is not a list of things to fix about yourself. It is something older and quieter than that. Tonight we are going to walk through 25 truths from one of the most enduring philosophical traditions in human history. Stoicism. Not as abstract ideas, not as motivational fuel, but as mirrors. Each truth is a mirror, and when you look into it, you may recognize something you have always known but never had the words to say. By the end of this first part, something will have shifted, not fixed, not solved, just shifted, the way a room feels different when someone opens a window. The same room, the same night. But air is moving now, and you can breathe. The Stoics were not cheerful men and women who taught people to smile through difficulty. They were people who sat down very seriously with the reality of suffering and refused to look away. They looked directly at the things that cause human beings the most pain. The uncertainty of the future, the weight of the past, the fear of loss, the hunger for control. And they said, we can work with this. Not around it, through it. And the first thing they asked was the simplest and the most difficult thing of all. They asked, can you pause? Not forever. Not even for long, just for a moment, just long enough to ask what is actually happening inside me right now. Not what I think is happening, not what I'm afraid is happening, what is actually right now happening. That question is the beginning of everything. So let us begin. Truth 1, the mind is not the enemy, but it is not the master either. Here is something Marcus Aurelius wrote in the 2nd century, alone in a military tent somewhere on the frozen edge of the Roman Empire. He was not writing for publication. He was not writing for posterity. He was writing to himself in his private journal, trying to keep himself together during years of plague and war and the relentless demands of being emperor of the known world. He wrote, "You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this and you will find strength." Simple words, you've probably seen them before, on a poster maybe, on someone's phone screen, and you nodded and moved on, because they seemed obvious. Of course you have power over your mind. Of course external events don't control you, but do they feel obvious tonight? Because there is a gap, and it is a very human gap, between what we know intellectually and what we actually experience inside ourselves. You know that your boss's opinion of you is not a life or death matter. You know that the argument you had 3 days ago is over. You know that worrying about next month changes nothing about next month. You know all of this. And yet the mind keeps going there, keeps pulling you into it, It keeps treating old information like it's still fresh, like it still needs processing, like it still needs a resolution that will never come. Marcus Aurelius knew this too. That's why he was writing it to himself. He was the most powerful man on earth, and he was reminding himself daily that his mind was not automatically his master, that the mind left unchecked will run, that the thoughts that arise in you are not all yours to keep, that you can watch a thought arrive, acknowledge it, and choose not to follow it wherever it wants to go. This is not suppression. This is not the dangerous business of pushing things down and pretending they're not there. It is something more like observation, like watching clouds. You don't have to become the cloud to notice that a cloud is passing through. The mind is a remarkable instrument, but it is an instrument. It serves you. You do not serve it. Tonight, if a thought arrives that wants to pull you somewhere you don't need to go, you are allowed to notice it. You are allowed to say, I see you, and then turn back to this moment, to this breath, to this quiet. That is truth one. The mind is not the enemy, but it needs a gentle, consistent, patient hand. Truth two, busyness is not the same as living. There is a man named Seneca who lived in Rome in the 1st century. He was a playwright, a philosopher, a senator, a man of tremendous wealth and influence, and he spent much of his life running, not physically, but in the way that clever, ambitious, anxious people run, from appointment to appointment, from obligation to obligation, from status to status, always moving, always doing, always constructing the next version of a life that would finally feel like enough. And then the Emperor Nero, who was his former student, which is one of history's darker ironies, forced him into exile, and then years later forced him to die. But in the period between the exile and the death, Seneca stopped running. He retreated, he wrote letters, he sat with questions he had been too busy to ask, and the letters he wrote during that time are among the most honest, most searingly direct things any human being has ever committed to paper. In one of those letters, he wrote something that may land differently tonight than it would in the middle of a busy afternoon. He wrote, "It is not that I have so much time, it is that I have stopped wasting it." And then later, in the same letter, the greatest obstacle to living is expectancy, which hangs upon tomorrow and loses today. Read that again slowly if you can. The greatest obstacle to living is expectancy, hanging upon tomorrow, losing today. How much of your mental life is spent in a version of tomorrow that hasn't arrived yet? How much of your energy goes toward constructing scenarios, good ones, bad ones, terrifying ones, hopeful ones that exist entirely in the imagination? How often do you arrive in a moment, a real moment, a moment that is actually happening right now, and find that you are only half there? Because the other half of you is already somewhere else, worrying about or planning or dreading what comes next. This is not a character flaw. This is what minds do. This is what human minds have always done. Seneca wasn't immune to it. Marcus Aurelius wasn't immune to it. The Stoics weren't people who had transcended the human condition. They were people who had simply gotten very honest about what the human condition actually was. And what they found again and again was this: busyness is not the same as living. You can be extraordinarily busy and never actually be present for a single moment of your life. You can fill every hour with activity and end the year feeling hollow, like you missed it somehow, like life was happening just slightly to the left of where you were standing, and you kept turning to look for it, but it had already moved on. The Stoics asked a very inconvenient question. What are you actually doing with your time? Not as a productivity challenge, not as a self-improvement exercise, just as a genuine question. Is this moment, this activity, this conversation, this choice, is this what you would choose if you remembered that your time here is not infinite? This is truth too. Busyness is a way of avoiding the present, and the present is the only place where life actually happens. Truth 3. You are not your thoughts. This is perhaps the most quietly liberating thing the Stoics understood, and it is the thing that most people in the modern world have the hardest time grasping. Not because it is complicated, but because it runs against something very deep in how we have been taught to understand ourselves. We live in a culture that tells us you are what you think. Your thoughts reveal who you are. Your inner voice is your authentic self. And so when frightening thoughts appear, thoughts of failure, thoughts of worthlessness, thoughts of terrible things happening to people you love, it feels like these thoughts are you, like they mean something, like they are telling you something true about what you are, or what you want, or what you deserve. But the Stoics made a distinction that changes everything when you really take it in. They distinguished between what they called the hegemonikon, the ruling faculty, the conscious self, the thing that observes, and the stream of impressions and thoughts and images that pass through the mind constantly, whether we want them to or not. Thoughts arise unbidden. Images appear. Fears surface. These are not you. These are what the mind does. The mind is a meaning-making machine, and it runs constantly, and it produces all kinds of output that does not necessarily represent any deep truth about who you are. Epictetus, who was born a slave, which puts rather a different frame on his philosophy of inner freedom, Epictetus said that the only thing truly ours is our faculty of choice, what he called prohairesis, the capacity to choose how we respond to what arises, not to choose what arises. We cannot choose that. Thoughts come whether we invite them or not. Feelings surface. Fears knock on the door. We cannot prevent the knock, but we do not have to open the door and let the fear move in and rearrange the furniture. You are not the anxiety that visits at 2 a.m. You are the awareness that notices the anxiety. You are not the self-critical voice that tells you you're not enough. You are the consciousness that hears that voice and can, with practice, choose not to believe everything it says. This is not spiritual bypassing. This is not telling you that feelings aren't real. They are real. They land hard. They hurt genuinely, but they are visitors, and you are the house. And the house does not become the weather that passes through it. Tonight, if a difficult thought surfaces and it may try to hold it the way you might hold a stone you found on a beach, look at it. It's real. It's there. But it doesn't have to define the evening. You can set it down. You can return to this voice, this quiet, this presence of being here. That is truth 3. You are not your thoughts. You are the one who watches them. Truth 4. Stillness is not the absence of action, it is the foundation of it. There is a confusion that runs very deep in modern life, and it sounds like this. If I am not moving, I'm falling behind. If I am not producing, I am failing. If I am resting, I am wasting time. If I am quiet, something is wrong with me. This confusion has roots that go deep in economics, in education, in the particular form of capitalism that has shaped the world many of us inhabit. But regardless of its origins, the experience of it is the same. There is guilt in stillness. There is anxiety in rest. There is a voice that says, you should be doing more. The Stoics would have found this deeply strange, not because they were lazy. They were, in fact, extraordinarily active people. Marcus Aurelius led armies, administered an empire, dealt with constant political crises, and still found time to write deeply about the inner life. Seneca produced enormous amounts of work. Epictetus ran a philosophy school for decades. These were not passive men sitting in caves, but they understood something that our age seems to have forgotten. Action that is not rooted in stillness is noise. Motion without inner groundedness is not productivity. It is panic dressed up as purpose. When Marcus Aurelius sat down each morning to write in his journal, which is what the meditations are, private morning writings, he was not procrastinating. He was doing the single most important thing he could do before facing the demands of his day. He was checking in with himself. He was asking, What do I actually believe? What do I value? What kind of person am I trying to be today? He was laying a foundation before he built anything on it. Imagine a house built on sand. It looks fine from the outside. It might look better than the house on the hill, which is slower to construct, which pauses to test the ground. But we know how the story ends. Stillness is the ground testing. Stillness is the checking that the foundation is solid before you start placing weight on it. And here is the quieter truth beneath this truth. When you are still, genuinely still, not just physically motionless but inwardly quiet, you access a quality of thinking that is simply not available when you are running. The best ideas you have ever had did not come to you while you were frantically busy. They came in the shower, on a walk, in that half-conscious space between sleep and waking, in the moments when the doing stopped and something else was allowed to surface. Stillness is not the opposite of life. Stillness is where life becomes legible. That is truth 4. Truth 5. The obstacle is not in your way. The obstacle is the way. This is one of the most famous Stoic ideas, made famous again in our time by Ryan Holiday, but it originates in Marcus Aurelius, who wrote, "The impediment to action advances action. What stands in the way becomes the way." And before we move through this quickly because it sounds familiar, let's slow down inside it for a moment. What does it actually mean? It means that the thing you're resisting right now, the difficulty, the discomfort, the person who is frustrating you, the situation that is not what you wanted, is not a detour from your life. It is your life. It is the material you have been given to work with, and how you engage with it, what you bring to it, who you become in the process of facing it. That is the actual substance of what your existence is made of. This is not optimism. The Stoics were not optimists in the cheerful sense. They were not saying everything happens for a reason. It'll all work out, trust the process. They were saying something harder and stranger and more useful than that. They were saying this difficult thing in front of you is not a punishment. It is not evidence that you are unlucky or cursed or fundamentally broken. It is simply what is here. And what is here is what you have to work with. So the question is not, why is this happening to me? The question is, what can I make of this? Who do I want to be in the face of this? There is a story about Epictetus that is almost certainly embellished but carries a truth regardless. He was enslaved as a child. His master at some point twisted his leg, either as punishment or as a test of Epictetus's philosophy. Epictetus reportedly said, as the leg was being twisted, "You are going to break it." And when it broke, he said calmly, "Did I not tell you it would break?" This is not the story of a man who didn't feel pain. It is the story of a man who had decided that there was a part of him that could not be broken regardless of what happened to his body. That the inner life, the capacity to observe, to choose, to maintain dignity was not the leg. The leg could be broken. The inner life could not. You may not face anything as extreme as Epictetus faced, but tonight, whatever obstacle sits in your mind, whatever situation feels stuck, whatever path feels blocked, ask gently, what if this is the way, not the thing blocking the way? What if the friction itself is the teacher? That is truth 5. Truth 6. You're rehearsing the wrong scenarios. Here is something the Stoics noticed about the human mind that is remarkably accurate and still remarkably underappreciated. We are natural scenario rehearsers. The mind runs simulations. It imagines futures. It prepares. This is, in many ways, a survival mechanism. The brain that can imagine the tiger before it arrives is more likely to survive the actual tiger. But the simulations we run are not balanced. They have a bias, a very strong, very consistent bias toward the negative. We rehearse failure far more often than we rehearse success. We rehearse humiliation far more often than we rehearse grace. We imagine the worst outcome with vivid, cinematic detail, and we imagine the best outcome with vague, skeptical blurriness. The result is that we suffer futures that never arrive. We grieve losses that haven't happened. We brace for impacts that will never come. This is not a personal failing. It is again a feature of the architecture. Psychologists call it negativity bias. The brain weighs bad outcomes more heavily than good ones because historically, bad outcomes were more consequential. The cost of underestimating a threat was death. The cost of overestimating it was unnecessary fear. Given those stakes, the brain evolved to err toward fear. But we are not. Most of us navigating threats that will kill us. We are navigating social situations, career uncertainties, relationship complexities. And for those, the constant negative rehearsal is not protective. It is corrosive. The Stoics had a practice for this. They called it premeditatio malorum, the premeditation of evils. But it was not the anxious, looping kind of negative thinking. It was deliberate, bounded, purposeful. You sat down and you imagined the worst possible outcome, fully, clearly. And then you asked, could I face this? Could I survive this? Would my character hold? In most cases, the answer was yes. Not easily, not without pain, but yes. And that yes changed something. Because the fear of the worst-case scenario is always larger than the worst-case scenario itself. The imagined disaster is more terrifying than the actual disaster. Because in the imagination, you are alone and helpless and frozen. In the actual disaster, something in you rises to meet it. The Stoic practice of negative visualization was not about feeding anxiety. It was about defanging it. By looking directly at what you fear most, you find that it is large but not infinite, that it has edges, that it is survivable, and then, having looked at it honestly, you could set it down. You're allowed to set it down tonight. That is truth 6. Truth 7. What you own does not protect you from what you feel. Seneca was one of the wealthiest men in Rome. He owned multiple estates. He had influence and access and all the material comfort that the ancient world could provide. And he wrote with extraordinary candor about how none of it touched the thing underneath. The hunger, the restlessness, the feeling that something was still missing even when everything was present. He wrote, "Seek not the good in external things, seek it within yourself." And he wrote this not as someone who had never had external things. He wrote it as someone who had had everything and discovered that everything was not enough. This is not the sour wisdom of someone who never got what they wanted. This is the honest testimony of someone who got exactly what they wanted and found that the wanting continued regardless. This is a very specific kind of grief. The grief of the person who achieves the goal and waits for the feeling they were promised and it doesn't come. Or it comes, but it is smaller than expected and it lasts less time than expected, and then the familiar restlessness returns like a tide and you find yourself already looking toward the next thing, the next level, the next acquisition, the next version of yourself that will finally feel complete. The Stoics called this the hedonic treadmill 2,000 years before psychologists gave it that name. They understood that the outer life could not solve the inner problem. That comfort without meaning is a slow starvation, that a full house can coexist with an empty life. This is not an argument against having things or building things or working toward goals. The Stoics were not ascetics who rejected the world. They were people who lived fully in the world while knowing that the world was not the source of what they were looking for. What you are looking for is not outside. It never was. That is truth 7. Truth 8. Speed is a way of not being here. There is a reason everything seems to move faster now, not just the technology, not just the notifications and the feeds and the constant summons of the alert. There is a speed to modern life that is not incidental. It is in some sense strategic, because speed prevents a certain kind of reckoning. If you're moving fast enough, you never have to sit with the questions that arise when you stop. Questions like, is this the life I actually want? Is this relationship bringing me closer to who I am or further away? Am I doing the work I'm doing because it means something to me or because I'm afraid of what would happen if I stopped? These are not comfortable questions, and speed is one of the most elegant ways of avoiding them. The Stoics were insistent on slowness, not slowness of production or laziness of life, but slowness of internal response. They called it the pause between stimulus and response. The moment, however brief, in which you can choose what happens next rather than simply reacting. Viktor Frankl, centuries later, would find this same insight in the most extreme circumstances imaginable in the concentration camps of the Second World War. He wrote that between stimulus and response there is a space, and in that space is our power. And in that power is our freedom. The Stoics would have recognized this completely. The pause is everything. The pause is where your humanity lives. When someone says something unkind to you, the pause is the moment between hearing it and responding. In that moment, the entire range of human response is available to you. You can wound back, you can retreat, you can forgive, you can understand, you can choose dignity. Without the pause, you are a mechanism. Input and output, stimulus and response. With the pause, you are a person. That is Truth 8. Truth 9. You are more capable of endurance than you believe. There is a particular flavor of modern anxiety that is not about big catastrophes. It is about the weight of ongoing difficulty, the day after day of managing something hard. The chronic nature of certain struggles, financial pressure, health concerns, relationship strain, the relentless grind of trying to build something meaningful in a world that is noisy and resistant and indifferent. The fear is not always that something terrible will happen. Sometimes the fear is simply, I don't know how long I can keep doing this, and the Stoics have something to say about this. Not in a motivational way, not in the way of a poster that tells you to keep going, in a more honest, more grounded way. They say, you have already endured more than you give yourself credit for. Think about that for a moment. Think about the things that happened in your life that, before they happened, you would have said, I don't know if I could survive that. The losses, the failures, the disappointments, the moments when the floor dropped away and you didn't know what would catch you. And somehow you're here, reading this, breathing, present. Whatever caught you, something did. Marcus Aurelius lost children. He governed through a plague that killed millions. He faced betrayal from people he trusted, and he wrote repeatedly. Not about being invincible, but about drawing on something inside himself that he didn't always know was there until it was needed. He wrote, never esteem anything as of advantage to you that will make you break your word or lose your self-respect. He was reminding himself that the self is not a fixed quantity, that it can grow to meet the difficulty, that the capacity for endurance is not something you have to find before the hard thing arrives. It develops in the encounter with the hard thing. You're more capable than tonight's fear is telling you. That is Truth 9, Truth 10. Comparison is a form of self-abandonment. Somewhere in the Roman world, someone was doing better than Marcus Aurelius. Someone had a better dinner. Someone's children were healthier. Someone's province was more peaceful. Someone had discovered a philosophy he hadn't read yet. And Marcus Aurelius, who was literally the most powerful man in the known world, could have spent every day measuring himself against others, finding gaps, feeling insufficient. He didn't, or rather he noticed when he was doing it and worked against it. He wrote, the first rule is to keep an untroubled spirit. The second is to look things in the face and know them for what they are. Looking at things for what they are means looking at your life as it is, not as it compares to someone else's life as it appears to be. Comparison is not inherently destructive. There are forms of comparison that are genuinely motivating, that help you calibrate, that give you useful information. But the comparison that the mind runs late at night, the involuntary anxious kind, the scrolling through other people's highlight reels kind, this comparison is not information. It is a way of abandoning yourself. When you're measuring your inner life against someone else's outer life, You're not seeing either life clearly. You are seeing your authentic interior reality against a performance, a highlight reel against a director's cut. And of course, the performance looks better. It was designed to. Every person you compare yourself to is carrying something you cannot see from the outside. Every life that looks whole from a distance has its cracks that are invisible at range. The Stoic practice is not to blind yourself to what others have. It is to return again and again to what is actually yours. Your work, your relationships, your choices, your character. These are the only things you can tend. These are the only things that are actually your life. Come home to yourself. That is truth 10. Truth 11. Anger borrows against a future you haven't lived yet. Seneca wrote an entire essay on anger. 3 books of it, actually, a long, beautiful, deeply personal examination of what anger is, what it costs, what it does to the person who holds it. He was not writing from a detached philosophical distance. He knew his own anger. He had felt what it was to want to hurt something because you felt hurt by it. He wrote, "Consider how much more you often suffer from your anger and grief than from those very things for which you are angry and grieved." Read that again slowly. How much of the suffering has been the anger itself, rather than the thing that caused the anger? Think of the last time you were genuinely angry at someone. Think of how long the anger lasted. Think of how it colored the hours that came after. Hours in which the other person was probably not thinking about you at all, was probably eating dinner or watching something or sleeping peacefully, completely unaware that you were still carrying the heat of what happened between you. The anger that you hold does not touch the person you're angry at. It only touches you. This is not an argument for suppression. The Stoics were not advocates for the silent swallowing of legitimate grievances. They were advocates for the recognition that your inner state belongs to you, that you are not obligated to carry the weight of someone else's thoughtlessness or cruelty in your own body, your own mind, your own quiet hours. Anger is information. It tells you that a value was violated, that a line was crossed, that something mattered to you. That information is worth having. But once you have received the information, you are allowed to set down the anger. It has done its job. Carrying it further serves nothing except the depletion of you. Tonight, if there is something you've been angry about, it is allowed to rest. You don't have to resolve it. You don't have to forgive completely right now. But you are allowed to not carry it actively into the hours that are meant for rest. That is truth 11. Truth 12. The present moment is not a problem to solve. There is a quality of mind, very common, very human, very understandable, that treats the present moment as something to get through on the way to a better future moment. This is how we endure dentist appointments and boring meetings, but it becomes a problem when it becomes the default mode, when every present moment is merely a stepping stone to the next, when the now is always instrumental, always a means, never an end in itself. The Stoics were not the first or the last to notice this, but they named it clearly and they worked against it with great discipline. Marcus Aurelius wrote, "Confine yourself to the present." Simple, almost annoying in its simplicity, but what he meant was, this moment right now does not need to be escaped. It does not need to be upgraded. It does not need to be completed as quickly as possible so that you can arrive at a future moment that will be better. It is what it is, and in being what it is completely and without apology, it is already enough. This is not passivity. It is not the surrender of aspiration or the abandonment of growth. It is the recognition that growth happens in moments. And if you're never actually in the moments, you're never actually growing. You are just planning to grow in some future moment that keeps receding as you reach for it. The present moment is not a waiting room. It is the room right now, wherever you are, whatever the room looks like, whatever the hour you are, and the only moment that exists. The past is memory, the future is imagination. The present is what is actually happening. and it is the only thing that is actually happening, and it is the only thing you can actually touch. Touch it. That is truth 12. Truth 13. Discipline is the most underrated form of self-love. The word discipline has been damaged by overuse in the wrong context. It has come to mean punishment, rigidity, the denial of pleasure, the grinding production of achievement for achievement's sake. And in that form, it is not self-love. It is a different kind of cruelty. But there is another form of discipline, quieter, warmer, less dramatic, that looks quite different. It is the discipline of the person who keeps small promises to themselves, who goes to bed when the body is tired, who steps outside when the walls close in, who reaches for the water instead of the thing that numbs, who puts the phone down not because a rule says so, but because they have learned to feel the cost of the alternative. Epictetus said, "No man is free who is not master of himself." Master of yourself, not in the sense of domination or suppression. Master in the sense of knowing yourself well enough to know what you actually need versus what your most frightened or most impulsive self is asking for. These are not always the same thing. The mind you bring to the hard moments of your life is the mind you have been building in the ordinary moments. Every time you chose patience over reaction, every time you chose rest over compulsive scrolling, every time you chose honesty with yourself over comfortable self-deception, you were building something. A kind of inner architecture that holds weight when weight arrives. The Stoics were not joyless. They laughed. They loved food and company and the beauty of the world. But they understood that the person who can delay gratification, who can sit with discomfort without running from it, who can choose the harder right thing over the easier wrong thing, this person is not impoverished by their discipline. They are free. That is truth 13, truth 14. Other people are not the problem. Your expectations of them are. One of the most practically useful Stoic observations and one of the most humbling is this: almost all of your frustration with other people is, at its root, the frustration of an unmet expectation. Someone didn't do what you needed them to do. Someone didn't show up in the way you assumed they would. Someone who had in your mind a certain role to play in your story chose to play a different one, and the frustration you feel is real. But it is located not in what they did, but in the gap between what they did and what you expected. Marcus Aurelius had a practice for this. Before engaging with the world each morning, he reminded himself of what he would encounter. He wrote, "Say to yourself first thing in the morning, today I shall meet with meddling, ungrateful, violent, treacherous, malicious, unsociable people." This is not cynicism, this is preparation. By removing the expectation that people would behave ideally, he removed the mechanism that turned normal human behavior into a personal offense. People are difficult, people are inconsistent. People are acting from their own fear and their own history and their own needs that have nothing to do with you, even when they seem to be entirely directed at you. This is not an excuse for cruelty, but it is a context for understanding. When you lower the expectation, not to indifference, but to realism, something loosens. The offense that felt deliberate begins to look more like damage. The person who frustrated you begins to look more like a person who is struggling in ways that have leaked onto you. You can still hold them accountable. You can still choose not to let their behavior shape yours. But the personal sting fades when you understand that it was never really personal. That is truth 14. Truth 15, you're allowed to not know. This is one of the most quietly liberating permissions the Stoics offer, and it is one that our culture, with its relentless demand for certainty and clarity and decisive action, makes very difficult to accept. You are allowed to not know where you're going. You are allowed to not know what you want. You are allowed to sit in the genuine uncertainty of an open question without forcing a premature answer just to end the discomfort of not knowing. Socrates, who was not a Stoic but whose influence runs through everything the Stoics did, built his entire philosophy on the acknowledgement that the wisest thing he had discovered was how much he did not know. "I know that I know nothing," or something close to that, is what the tradition attributes to him, not as defeat, as discovery, as the necessary clearing of false certainty that made room for real thinking. The Stoics carried this. They distinguished between what they could know with certainty and what they were guessing at. They tried to hold their beliefs, even strong ones, with a certain lightness, not to abandon conviction, but to remain open to being wrong, to remain curious about the world and about themselves. Tonight, whatever questions sit unanswered in you, they are allowed to sit unanswered. Not every question is a problem. Some questions are companions. They walk with you for years, and the walking with them changes you, and eventually something shifts and what was dark becomes a little clearer. But that clarity comes not from forcing it. It comes from patience, from the willingness to live inside the question without demanding that it resolve itself before you are ready to receive the answer. You are allowed to not know. That is Truth 15. Truth 16, the virtue of living simply. Somewhere between having nothing and having everything, there is a quality of life that the Stoics found most conducive to peace, not poverty. They were not advocating deprivation, but simplicity. The kind of life where your needs and your means are in rough alignment, where you are not stretched thin by obligations to maintain a version of yourself that requires constant upkeep. Seneca wrote about this with the particular authority of a rich man who had tested the theory. He wrote that he deliberately spent days living as if he had nothing, eating simple food, wearing plain clothes, sleeping on a hard surface, not as penance, but as practice, as a way of discovering that the things he feared losing were, in fact, survivable to lose. He wrote, "I am not exhorting you to poverty, but to frugality. Frugality is not deprivation. It is a relationship with your possessions in which you own them rather than them owning you, in which the object serves you rather than you serving the object, in which the lifestyle you maintain does not require you to compromise your peace, your honesty, or your time in order to sustain it." How much of the busyness and the anxiety and the treadmill of modern life is, at its root, the maintenance cost of a complexity that was never really chosen? The possessions that require upkeep, the status that requires performance, the image that requires management, the life that looks full from the outside and feels hollow from the inside, because the inside is where you actually live. You are allowed to simplify. You are allowed to ask what you actually need, rather than what you have been told to want. You are allowed to discover that the simpler version of your life might be lighter in a way that feels not like less, but like free. That is Truth 16. Truth 17. Regret looks backward. Wisdom looks at what is here. Regret is one of the heaviest things the human mind carries. Not because the past is heavy in itself. The past is finished, unchangeable, beyond the reach of any force in the universe, but because we carry it forward, we carry it into the present. We carry it into our experience of this moment, this day, this life, contaminating what is here with the weight of what cannot be changed. The Stoics were not unsympathetic to regret. Marcus Aurelius wrote honestly about things he had done that he was not proud of. Seneca acknowledged mistakes and misjudgments with characteristic directness. Regret is information again. It tells you what you valued. It tells you what kind of person you wanted to be and felt you had fallen short of. That information is worth having, but the information is received in a moment, and then it can be used. You can use the information from regret to change how you behave going forward. You can use it to understand yourself better. You can use it to make different choices. What you cannot use it for, though we often try, is changing the past. The past will not yield. It is the most fixed thing in existence. The Stoic practice with regret is to receive it, to extract the lesson if there is one, and then to place it down. Not because the past doesn't matter, not because pain doesn't deserve acknowledgement, but because the present, this evening, this hour, this quiet moment is happening regardless of what you carry into it, and it deserves your presence. It deserves you here, actual, available, awake, whatever you regret from the past. It has already taught you everything it can teach you. The teaching does not require you to relive it indefinitely. That is Truth 17. Truth 18. Fear of death is, at its core, a failure to live. This is one of the oldest and most consistent themes in Stoic philosophy, and it is worth sitting with carefully because it is often misunderstood. The Stoics were not advocating for recklessness or for a cheerful dismissal of mortality. They were advocating for something much more subtle, the integration of mortality into the living of life. Marcus Aurelius wrote about death constantly, not obsessively, not morbidly, but consistently, the way a good musician returns to certain notes, because they need to be played regularly to be understood. He wrote, "You could leave life right now. Let that determine what you do and say and think." And Seneca, "Let us prepare our minds as if we had come to the very end of life. Let us postpone nothing. Let us balance life's books each day." This is the practice they called memento mori. Remember that you will die. Remember that the time is not infinite. Remember that the conversation you're having, the evening you're in, the life you're living, it is happening now, and the now is not guaranteed to be followed by another now. The fear of death, when it runs unexamined, has a way of stealing life. It creates a paradox. You avoid thinking about death in order to protect your comfort, and in doing so, you avoid a truth that, if faced, would make your life richer. The person who has genuinely integrated the reality of their mortality tends to be, paradoxically, more alive, more present, more able to feel the weight and beauty of the ordinary. You are here, right now, in a moment that will not come again. Whatever you're holding on to, that is keeping you from being fully present for it. You are allowed to set it down. That is Truth 18. Truth 19. Attention is the most valuable thing you possess. There is a currency the modern world wants very badly that you rarely hear discussed in those terms. It is not money. It is not status. It is your attention, your focus, the direction of your consciousness. Every algorithm, every notification, every piece of content designed for engagement is, at its root, a bid for what you are looking at right now. The Stoics couldn't have named this in modern terms, but they understood it in principle. Marcus Aurelius wrote, "If you are distressed by anything external, the pain is not due to the thing itself, but to your estimate of it, and this you have the power to revoke at any moment." But there is a precondition to revoking your estimate of a thing. You have to be paying attention. You have to be present enough to notice what is happening in you, to notice the thought that is arising, to recognize that you have a choice about whether to follow it or not. If your attention is scattered, pulled in 17 directions simultaneously, half here and half somewhere else, this capacity is simply unavailable to you. Where your attention goes, your life goes. This is not metaphor. It is quite literal. The experiences that shape you, the relationships that nourish you, the work that builds you, these require presence. They require you to actually show up for them. And showing up requires that you know where you are, that you have some say over the direction of your focus, that you have practiced the art of returning to what matters when the noise pulls you away. This is one of the most practically urgent pieces of Stoic wisdom in the present moment. Not because the Stoics predicted social media or the attention economy, but because they understood that the quality of your interior life depends on what you allow in, on what you give your focus to, on whether you're directing your attention or simply surrendering it to whatever is loudest. Guard your attention. It is the most valuable thing you have. That is Truth 19. Truth 20. The body knows what the mind tries to ignore. The Stoics were not pure intellectuals. They were not people who lived entirely in abstraction, who treated the body as an inconvenient vehicle for the mind. They were remarkably attentive to the relationship between the physical and the psychological. They noticed that the state of the body shapes the state of the mind, that a person who sleeps poorly, eats badly, moves little, and breathes shallowly will find philosophy very difficult to practice. Marcus Aurelius wrote extensively about the importance of taking care of the physical self, not as vanity, not as performance, but as maintenance of the instrument through which everything else is experienced. Seneca recommended walking. Epictetus was attentive to the relationship between breath and emotional state. The modern word for this is embodiment. The recognition that you are not a brain in a jar, that the anxiety you feel in your chest is real, physical, located in tissue and chemistry, that the restlessness of late nights is in part a body that needs movement and instead got stillness, that needs daylight and instead got screens, that needs breathing room and instead got compression. When the mind loops and the thoughts circle and the quiet you're reaching for seems to recede, sometimes the most useful thing is not more thinking. It is a breath, deliberately, fully, the kind that expands the chest and fills the belly and releases slowly, not once, several times, until the nervous system receives the message that it is safe, that this moment is not a threat, that the body can unclench. The Stoics trusted the integration of body and mind. They knew that the inner life was not suspended in a philosophical vacuum. It was incarnate. It was housed in blood and breath and the particular heaviness of a tired body at the end of a long day. Take care of the body tonight. It is the home of everything you are. That is Truth 20. Truth 21. Other people's judgments are none of your business. Epictetus said it plainly. If someone speaks badly of you, what concern is that of yours? It is their opinion, their problem, not yours. This is easy to hear. It is not always easy to receive, because we are social creatures and we care what others think of us. And the caring is not irrational. Historically, social rejection was dangerous. To be cast out of the group was to face survival alone. The fear of judgment is ancient and biological and does not respond well to being told it is irrational. But there is a difference between information about social standing and the constant corrosive anxiety of not knowing what people think of you, of managing your image, of adjusting what you say and how you appear and what you share based on an imagined audience that may not exist or may not care as much as you fear. The Stoics asked a clarifying question. Is this person's judgment based on an accurate understanding of who I am and what I have done? If yes, if the criticism is fair, then it is useful information. Receive it, use it, grow. If no, if the judgment is based on misunderstanding or malice or their own projection, then it says more about them than it says about you. And there is nothing you can do to control another person's internal process. You will not be able to convince everyone. You will not be able to be understood by everyone. Some people will see you incorrectly and conclude things that are not true. This is painful. It is genuinely painful. But it is also simply true. It is part of the territory of being a person among other persons. The only thing you can control is the quality of your character, the honesty of your actions, the integrity of how you live. If those are intact, the rest is noise. That is Truth 21. Truth 22. Nature heals what thought cannot. There is a passage in Marcus Aurelius that is easy to read past because it sounds like a small thing, but is actually quite large. He wrote about the way bread, when baked, cracks on the surface. And the cracks are unplanned, unintended, not part of the baker's design, and yet they are beautiful. They add something. They are part of what the bread is. He was noticing that nature produces beauty without trying to produce beauty, that the beauty is a byproduct of process, that the cracked loaf is not inferior to the smooth one. It is more honest. It shows what happened to it. The Stoics were unusual among ancient philosophers in their genuine attention to the natural world. They believed that nature was rational, that the universe had a logos, a structuring principle, and that aligning with nature rather than fighting it was one of the paths to peace. This was not passive, it was attentive. It meant watching the world carefully. It meant noticing the patterns. It meant understanding that human beings are not separate from the natural order, but part of it. There is something that happens when you put yourself in natural settings that is very difficult to manufacture indoors. Not just the visual beauty of it, something more fundamental. The scale changes. The trees that have stood for decades or centuries put your problems in a different frame. The sky that does not care about your schedule or your reputation or your plans creates a particular kind of relief. The sound of water or wind does something to the nervous system that no amount of thinking can replicate. If there is a way to step outside tomorrow, even briefly, even in a small way, the Stoics would probably recommend it. Not as therapy, not as performance, just as remembering what you are and where you are and how large the world actually is. That is truth 22. Truth 23. You already have enough to begin. There is a peculiar form of procrastination that the Stoics would have recognized, though they wouldn't have used that word. It is the procrastination of waiting until conditions are right, waiting until you have more knowledge, more money, more confidence, more certainty, a better plan, a clearer vision, the right moment. The right moment is a mythological creature. It has been cited by many and found by very few, because by the time the conditions seem right, new conditions have appeared that are not yet right, and the waiting continues. Marcus Aurelius wrote, "Waste no more time arguing about what a good man should be one." This is almost startlingly direct for a philosopher. No more theory, no more preparation, no more rehearsal. Just be the thing, now, with what you have, in the conditions that exist, not the conditions you're waiting for. This is not recklessness. It is not the advocacy of thoughtless leaping. It is the recognition that the gap between knowing and doing is often not a gap of knowledge. It is a gap of courage. And courage is not the absence of fear. It is the decision to begin despite the fear. You know more than you think you know. You have more resources than you think you have. The version of you that will exist after you have done the hard thing will not have been born from waiting until the hard thing felt safe. It will have been born from doing the hard thing while it still felt hard. Begin where you are, with what you have now. That is truth 23. Truth 24. Gratitude is not a feeling. It is a practice. The Stoics distinguished between emotions that arise spontaneously and the orientations toward life that are cultivated deliberately. Gratitude for them was not something you waited to feel. It was something you did actively, intentionally, even on the days when it did not come naturally. Marcus Aurelius, in the opening of the Meditations, spent several long passages simply listing the qualities he had received from the people in his life. His grandfather's gentleness, his father's modesty, his mother's piety, his teacher's patience. He was doing something very deliberate. He was cataloging what he had been given before he turned to the difficulties of governing the world, not as a way of bypassing the difficulties, as a way of grounding himself before facing them. Gratitude changes the frame of experience. It does not change the facts. The difficult thing remains difficult, the pain remains painful. But gratitude adds something to the frame. A recognition that even in the difficulty there is something here that did not have to be here. The breath that is still moving, the roof that is still holding, the person you're still able to call, the mind that is still capable of noticing the world. On nights when the gratitude does not come easily, and there are such nights and they are valid, and the difficulty of those nights does not mean you are doing something wrong. On those nights, the practice might be very small, one thing, just one thing that exists that did not have to exist, and it can be humble. It can be the warmth of the bed, the fact that the night is quiet, the fact that this voice, these words are here to sit with you. One thing is enough. That is truth 24. Truth 25. The examined life is not a burden, it is a homecoming. Socrates said that the unexamined life is not worth living. This has been quoted so many times that it has lost some of its texture. But sit inside it for a moment. Not worth living is a strong claim. What was Socrates pointing at? He was pointing at the peculiar tragedy of a person who moves through their entire life without ever really stopping to ask, who am I? What do I actually believe? What do I value? Not what I say I value, but what my choices reveal that I value. What kind of life am I actually building here? Not with self-criticism, not with judgment, just with genuine curiosity. The same curiosity you might bring to any interesting question, not with urgency, not with anxiety, but with the unhurried attention of someone who genuinely wants to understand. The Stoics took this seriously. The practice of daily reflection, the habit of examining your choices and your reactions and your thoughts, this was not penance for them. It was homecoming. It was the practice of becoming, over time, a person who knows themselves well enough to live with integrity, to be consistent, to act from genuine values rather than from fear or habit or the expectations of others. You are a person worth knowing. Your inner life is worth the time and the patience it takes to understand it. The questions you carry about meaning, about direction, about who you are and who you want to be, these are not problems to solve and be done with. They are the living of your life. The examined life is not a burden. It is the most intimate form of being alive. That is truth 25. And that is part 1. You have spent the last hour with 25 truths from one of humanity's most enduring traditions of inner work. And if any of them landed somewhere real, if any of them named something you had felt but not said, illuminated something you had seen but not acknowledged, then the walk has been worth taking. But we are only 1/3 of the way through the territory. Because the truths about slowing the mind, they change when the mind encounters something harder than restlessness. They change when the mind encounters pain, real pain. The kind that doesn't slow down when you tell it to. The kind that shows up uninvited and doesn't respond to technique. And it is there, in the territory of pain and the things we cannot control, that Stoic philosophy shows its true depth. In the next part, we turn toward that harder ground. 25 truths about pain and control, about what we suffer and why, about the extraordinary gap between what happens and what we tell ourselves about what happens. Seneca wrote, "You suffer more in imagination than in reality." That is the premise of part 2, and it will take a full hour to do justice to what it means. Continue when you're ready. If you're still here, then something in part 1 touched something real, and so it is time to go deeper. The first 25 truths were about slowing down, about pausing, about recognizing the quality of your attention and the architecture of your thought. They were, in a sense, the vestibule, the place you stand before you enter the main room. The main room is where we keep the things we don't look at often. The pain, the fear, the grief, the longing for control over a world that will not be controlled, the losses that have already happened and the losses that are still coming, the gap between how you wanted your life to feel and how it actually feels at 2 a.m. when the defenses are down and the only thing standing between you and the truth is however tired you are. The Stoics did not avoid this room. They walked directly into it. Every single major Stoic thinker faced suffering that was, by any reasonable measure, severe. Marcus Aurelius faced a plague, wars, the deaths of children. Seneca faced exile, execution under his own former student, the complete unraveling of everything he had built. Epictetus was enslaved, had his leg broken, owned nothing. These were not people theorizing from comfort. These were people who had been in the main room and had found, against all odds, something that held. What they found is what these next 25 truths are about. Let us enter the room together. Truth 26. Pain is inevitable. Suffering is largely optional. This is perhaps the most famous and most misunderstood Stoic claim. It sounds cold when stated baldly. It sounds like someone is trying to tell you that your pain is your fault, that you shouldn't feel what you feel, that the bad thing that happened to you is your responsibility. That is not what it means. The distinction the Stoics made, and the distinction the Buddha independently arrived at, and the distinction modern psychology has increasingly confirmed is between pain and suffering. Pain is the raw experience, the loss, the injury, the failure, the disappointment. It is real, it happens, it is not a choice. You did not choose to feel the loss of someone you loved. You did not choose to fail at the thing that mattered to you. You did not choose the fear or the grief or the loneliness. These arise. Suffering, in the sense the Stoics meant, is what happens next. It is the story you build around the pain, the meaning you assign, the narrative you construct, the interpretation. He left me because I am unlovable. I failed because I'm fundamentally insufficient. This pain means that my life is going in the wrong direction. This difficulty means that something is irreparably broken in me or in the world. These stories are the suffering, not the pain. The pain would pass if you let it. The story holds the pain in place. The story keeps you in the wound long after the wound itself would have healed. Seneca wrote, "We suffer more in imagination than in reality." And he was speaking precisely about this. Not that the reality is painless, but that the imagination amplifies it, extends it, deepens it in ways that the reality alone never would. The Stoic practice with pain is not to deny it. It is to hold the pain without immediately reaching for a story that makes it permanent or fundamental. To feel the loss without deciding that the loss means something final about you. Pain passes. Given time and space and honest attention, pain passes. Stories last much longer. That is truth 26. Truth 27. The circle of control is smaller than you think. That is good news. There is a small diagram that appears in almost every introduction to Stoicism. Two circles, one large, one small. The large circle is everything you care about, everything that affects your life, everything that occupies your worry. The small circle is everything you can actually control. The small circle, when you draw it honestly, contains essentially two things: your judgments and your choices. How you interpret what happens, how you respond to it. That's it. Everything else, other people's behavior, the weather, your health, the economy, the future, the past, other people's opinions of you, outcomes of your actions, the behavior of institutions and systems, everything else sits in the large circle. The first time people encounter this, it feels bleak. If I can control so little, what is the point? If all of this is outside my circle, what agency do I actually have? But sit with it a moment longer, because there's another way to read the small circle. The small circle is an extraordinary gift, because what it means is that the most important things, the qualities of your character, your capacity for integrity, your ability to choose kindness over cruelty, wisdom over reaction, presence over distraction, these things are entirely, completely, utterly yours. They cannot be taken from you. They cannot be given to you by someone else. They are not dependent on the weather or the economy or whether other people cooperate. They live inside the circle where you have full jurisdiction. And outside the circle, you are freed from it. Not indifferently, you can care about what happens in the large circle. You can work toward outcomes in the large circle, but you are freed from the tyranny of needing it to go a certain way. Freed from the crushing weight of feeling responsible for things that were never yours to control. Marcus Aurelius controlled an empire, but he did not waste himself trying to control everything in the empire. He focused, as his journal shows repeatedly, on what was inside his small circle, on being the kind of emperor he wanted to be, regardless of how the external events unfolded. The smaller your circle of control, the lighter you can live. That is truth 27. Truth 28. Resistance to pain often causes more pain than the pain itself. There is a mechanism that runs very deep in the human nervous system. It is called the fight or flight response, and it is extraordinarily useful when the threat is physical and immediate. Your body floods with stress hormones, your heart rate increases, your muscles prepare, your attention narrows to the threat. This is the body's response to danger. The problem is that this mechanism cannot distinguish between a tiger and a difficult conversation, between a physical threat and a painful feeling, between genuine danger and the anxiety about something that might happen someday. When emotional pain arrives, grief, shame, fear, loneliness, the nervous system often responds as if it were a physical threat. It braces, it tightens, it resists. It goes into the metaphorical equivalent of fight or flight. And here's the paradox. Resistance to pain amplifies pain. The bracing makes it worse. The tightening that is designed to protect you from the pain is the thing that holds the pain in place, the stoic practice. And here they were anticipated and confirmed by everything from Buddhist meditation to modern trauma therapy, is not resistance but observation. Not fighting the pain but watching it. Not trying to make it go away but actually being willing to be with it. This sounds simple. In practice, it is one of the most difficult things the human nervous system is ever asked to do, because the impulse to resist is biological, automatic, fast. But when you can do it, when you can sit with the pain and observe it rather than fighting it, when you can be curious about it rather than afraid of it, something remarkable happens. The pain, feeling witnessed rather than fought, often diminishes. Not immediately, not completely, but it finds its natural level. It does what pain does when you stop wrestling with it. It moves through. That is truth 28. Truth 29. Loss reveals what was real. Seneca, writing to his friend Lucilius from the relative peace of his later exile, offered this. True happiness is to enjoy the present without anxious dependence upon the future. Not to amuse ourselves with either hopes or fears, but to rest satisfied with what we have, which is sufficient, for he that is so wants nothing. But he also wrote in a different letter about loss, about the death of friends, about the particular grief of aging, which is a slow process of loss of the body and of the people you love and of versions of yourself that can no longer be recovered. He did not try to philosophize grief away. He sat with it, he acknowledged it, and he said something that is only really understood from inside it. Loss reveals what was real. The things we lose and are genuinely devastated to lose were the things that genuinely mattered. The grief is the measure of the love. The pain of the absence is the shape of the presence that was there. This is not a consolation prize. This is something more honest than consolation. It is a recognition that grief is not a problem with your emotional regulation. It is not evidence that you are weak or damaged or need to be fixed. It is evidence that you loved something real, that you were genuinely present for something, that the connection was not merely performed. In a world that often prizes emotional efficiency, getting over things quickly, not dwelling, moving on, Stoicism offers a different orientation. It says, grieve honestly, feel the full weight of what is gone. Let the loss be as large as it actually is, not indefinitely, not as a permanent residence, but as a genuine acknowledgement of what was real. And then, when the grief has said what it needs to say, gently return, not to forgetting, to living. That is truth 29. Truth 30. The story you tell about your past is not the past. Every person carries a biography, a story of what has happened to them, what it means, how it shaped them, what it says about the world and about themselves. This story is assembled from memory, which is imperfect, and from interpretation, which is colored by current emotion, and from the needs of the self, which sometimes needs the story to be a certain way in order to function. The past is fixed, but the story about the past is not. Marcus Aurelius knew this with regard to his own history. He was adopted. He was placed in a position of enormous power without having sought it. He had a difficult marriage by most historical accounts. He lost children. He was betrayed by people he trusted. He could have constructed a story from these facts that made him a victim, a man burdened by fate, a person to whom things were done rather than a person who chose how to respond to what was done. He chose a different story, not a dishonest one, not one that minimized the difficulty, but one in which he was always, regardless of circumstances, the author of his own response, the person in the story who chose how to meet what came. The story you tell about your past shapes what you believe is possible in your future. If the story is, I have always been this way, and therefore I will always be this way, then the future is predetermined and closed. If the story is, I have been shaped by what happened, but I am not identical to what happened, then the future is genuinely open. You are not your history. You are the consciousness that has had a history, and that consciousness is free in this moment, regardless of what any previous moment contained, to choose who it is going to be. That is Truth 30. Truth 31. Catastrophizing is not preparation. It is a form of self-harm. The mind that runs worst-case scenarios at 2 a.m. is not doing you a favor. It feels like preparation. It feels like being responsible. Like if you rehearse the disaster enough times, you will be ready when it comes. But it is not preparation. The anxious rehearsal of bad outcomes does not prepare you for those outcomes. What it does is deliver the emotional impact of the disaster before the disaster arrives, and often repeatedly again and again across many nights, while the actual capacity to respond is neither developed nor improved by the rehearsal. The Stoic practice of negative visualization, which we touched on in Part 1, is entirely different. It is deliberate, bounded, purposeful. You set aside time to consider the worst possible outcome. You ask, could I face this? You receive an honest answer, and then you return to the present. The catastrophizing that happens involuntarily in the mind's darker hours is none of these things. It is not bounded. It does not end in an honest assessment of resilience. It loops. It escalates. One bad outcome becomes 2, becomes 5, becomes the complete unraveling of everything. The mind that is running on exhaustion and stress is not a reliable narrator of what the future holds. The Stoics would say, when you notice the catastrophizing, you can name it. You can say, this is the mind in loop mode, this is the fearful voice, this is not information, this is noise. And you can, with gentleness rather than force, redirect, return to what is here, the room you're in, the body that is still breathing the moment. This one, that is not a catastrophe. That is Truth 31. Truth 32. Control is an illusion. Influence is real. This distinction is subtle, but it changes everything. The Stoics did not advocate for passivity in the face of difficulty. They did not say, because I cannot control outcomes, I will do nothing. They said, I cannot control outcomes, and therefore I will direct all of my energy toward what I can influence, which is how I engage, how I try, what quality I bring to my efforts. An athlete cannot control the outcome of a competition. There are too many variables: the weather, the form of the opponents, the decisions of officials, the chemistry of the body on a particular day. But an athlete can control the quality of their preparation, the consistency of their training, the honesty of their effort, the character they bring to competing. This is not mere consolation for losing. It is a genuinely superior orientation toward action. Because the person who is obsessively attached to outcomes often performs worse than the person who is focused on process. The attachment to results creates a pressure that narrows attention, tightens the body, generates a kind of cognitive interference that actually reduces the quality of performance. The stoic athlete, the stoic in any domain, performs better precisely because they have surrendered the need to control the outcome. Not because they don't care about the outcome, they care, but they have placed their care in the process rather than the result. Do your best, bring your full self, try honestly, and then accept whatever comes with as much grace as you can muster. That is the entire practical philosophy of Stoicism in 3 sentences. That is truth 32. Truth 33. The things you fear losing are already on loan. Epictetus had a practice he recommended with unusual directness. When you love something, a person, a possession, a situation, a version of your life, say to yourself, I have borrowed this. It belongs to the universe. I am caring for it, tending it, grateful for it, but it is not mine to keep permanently, and one day it will be returned. This sounds, on first reading, like a cold thing to say about the people you love, like it is asking you to hold them at a distance, to love without really loving. But when you sit inside it more carefully, something else emerges. The practice is not about distance, it is about gratitude. When you know that something is on loan, you tend it differently. You're more present for it. You appreciate it more fully because you're not assuming it will always be there. You bring more attention to the relationship, the conversation, the moment, because you have honestly acknowledged that this moment is not guaranteed to be followed by another moment of the same quality. There's a passage in Marcus Aurelius about his own children. He lost several children in infancy and childhood. The mortality rate among children in the Roman world was devastating, and he wrote not with bitterness or resignation, but with a quality of tender, clear-eyed awareness. When you kiss your child, he wrote, whisper to yourself, perhaps this one will die tomorrow. This is not morbid. Read in context. It is an act of love. It is the refusal to take the present for granted. It is the determination to actually be there fully, without the numbing assumption that there will always be another day. The people you love are on loan this evening. In whatever way is real for you, be present for them. That is truth 33. Truth 34. You cannot think your way out of feelings. You can feel your way through them. The Stoics were intellectuals. They were thinkers. They believed profoundly in the power of reason to shape a life. And this sometimes gives the impression that Stoicism is an approach to life that bypasses emotion in favor of pure reason. It is not. The Stoics did not advocate for the suppression or denial of emotion. They distinguished between what they called the passions, violent, irrational, overwhelming emotions that carry you away from yourself, and the eupatheiae, the good feelings, the appropriate emotional responses to the world, joy, caution, wishing well for others. These were not to be suppressed. They were to be cultivated. What the Stoics advised against was being governed by the passions rather than understanding them. There is a difference between feeling grief and being consumed by grief to the point where you lose all function. There is a difference between feeling fear and allowing fear to determine all of your choices. The feeling is valid. Being controlled by it is the problem. But here is the key insight that modern psychology has caught up to. You cannot think your way out of an emotion. You can reason about an emotion, you can contextualize it, you can understand it. But the emotional energy itself needs to move, needs to be felt, needs to pass through the nervous system before it clears. The person who keeps trying to reason away their grief will find the grief waiting for them around every corner. The person who allows the grief, who sits with it, who feels its full weight, who does not rush through it, this person often finds that the grief, having been genuinely felt, begins to move. Feel what you feel, fully, honestly, without rushing it, without performing it for an audience or suppressing it for an audience. The feeling is not the problem. The resistance to feeling is the problem. That is truth 34. Truth 35. Meaning is made, not found. There is a question that arrives in the small hours. in the gaps between occupation and sleep, in the quiet moments when distraction has not successfully kept it at bay. The question is, what is any of this for? It is an old question. It is perhaps the oldest human question. And the Stoics did not have an easy answer to it, because they were not purveyors of easy answers, but they had a direction. They said, meaning is not a thing hidden in the world that you discover if you look hard enough. It is not placed there for you to find like a key beneath a mat. It is something you construct through the quality of your engagement. It is a byproduct of living well, not a prerequisite for living. The life that feels meaningful is typically the life in which there is genuine engagement with something beyond the self, a craft practiced with care, a relationship tended with honesty and attention, a community contributed to, a difficult question pursued with genuine curiosity and intellectual honesty. The body moved and challenged and respected. The inner life attended to. Marcus Aurelius found meaning in duty, in the Stoic concept of kathekon, appropriate action, the thing that your situation calls you to do. He did not love the battlefield, he did not love the endless political maneuvering of the Roman court, but he understood that he had a role to play and that playing it with integrity was meaningful regardless of whether he enjoyed it. Seneca found meaning in writing, in the company of friends, in the slow, patient pursuit of wisdom across decades of reading and reflection. You do not need to have found your purpose in order to begin living meaningfully. Meaning grows from engagement. Begin engaging with the work you have, with the relationships you have, with the questions you have, and meaning will follow. It does not precede the doing. It is what the doing produces. That is truth 35. Truth 36. Chronic pain, emotional or physical, deserves patience, not punishment. There is a cruelty that many people practice against themselves that goes largely unnoticed because it is internal and invisible. It is the cruelty of adding criticism to difficulty, of feeling pain and then immediately asking, why can't I handle this better? What is wrong with me? Why is this still affecting me? The Stoics were not cruel to themselves in this way. This is important to understand because Stoicism is sometimes read as a harsh discipline. The image of the Stoic as someone who endures pain stoically, without expression, without complaint, through sheer will is a misreading. It is the cultural corruption of a very different idea. The actual Stoic practice with difficulty is more like steady, patient, persistent without being violent. Marcus Aurelius returned to the same struggles in his journal again and again, the same failures to live up to his own values, the same temptations, the same fears. He didn't berate himself for having to return to them. He just returned and returned and returned. That is what chronic difficulty requires, not the single heroic act of will that defeats the dragon once and for all. Not the breakthrough that resolves everything in a single cathartic moment, just the patient, steady, compassionate returning, day after day, night after night. If you are dealing with something that has not resolved quickly, a depression that has lasted months, a grief that refuses to pass on schedule, an anxiety that keeps returning even when you understand its irrationality, you are not failing at recovery. You are living with something that requires time. And time is the only thing that is genuinely non-negotiable. Be patient with yourself the way you would be patient with someone you love. That is truth 36. Truth 37. The desire for approval is a form of captivity. Epictetus, who understood captivity in the most literal sense, wrote about this with particular precision. He said that the person who needs the approval of others is not free, regardless of any physical freedom they may possess. Because their inner state depends on something outside their control, the opinions of other people. They are in a kind of psychological captivity that is as real as any physical constraint. Think about how much of your energy goes toward managing other people's perceptions of you, the way you phrase things to avoid misunderstanding, the things you don't say because you're afraid of how they'll land, choices you make that are shaped not by what you actually want, but by what you believe others expect. The image you present on surfaces designed for image presentation, the curated version of a life that is offered for evaluation and rated by strangers, none of this is shameful. It is human. We are social creatures, and the desire for belonging and approval is real and legitimate. But there is a difference between the natural, appropriate desire to be understood and liked, and the constant anxiety-driven management of your image at the expense of your authenticity. The Stoics were not interested in provocation. They were not advocating for the performance of not caring what people think, which is its own form of ego. They were advocating for the quiet internal establishment of what you actually value and the living of that consistently regardless of the response. The person who lives from their genuine values does not need to manage their image. The image takes care of itself when the living is honest. You're allowed to stop performing. That is Truth 37. Truth 38. Envy is a map of what you haven't yet accepted about yourself. The Stoics noticed that envy is never really about the person who has what you think you want. It is about the belief that what they have is what would make your life complete, and the belief underneath that your life as it currently is not enough. Envy points at a gap, not a gap between you and the other person. A gap between where you are and where you believe you should be. A gap between the life you have and the life you have been told by culture, by family, by the comparison engine of social media that you ought to have. The Stoics would say, the gap is real, but it is not located where you think it is. The gap is not between you and the person you envy. The gap is between the life you are living and the values you actually hold. Between what you say matters to you and what your choices reveal you are prioritizing. This is not a comfortable thing to notice, but it is useful because it redirects your attention from the impossible project of becoming someone else to the entirely possible project of becoming more honestly and fully yourself. The things you envy in others often tell you something true about what you genuinely want, not necessarily the specific thing. Not literally their job or their relationship or their house, but the quality those things represent, the freedom, the recognition, the connection, the sense of purpose. These are worth pursuing, but they must be pursued in your own life, in your own terms, from the actual ground of who you are. Envy, honestly examined, is a compass. It points toward the things that matter to you. That is Truth 38. Truth 39. Every vice masquerades as a virtue. This is one of the sharper observations in the Stoic tradition, and it requires a certain willingness to look inward with real honesty. The Stoics notice that the habits and patterns that cause us the most harm rarely present themselves as harmful. They present themselves as their opposite. Cowardice presents as wisdom. Cruelty presents as justice. Avoidance presents as discernment. The anger that is destroying a relationship presents as righteous principle. The perfectionism that prevents any action at all presents as high standards. The isolation that is starving you of connection presents as introversion or independence. Seneca was particularly clear-eyed about this. He wrote that most people's vices are their favorite things about themselves. The man who is ruthless calls himself decisive. The woman who is emotionally unavailable calls herself independent. The person who is perpetually angry calls themselves passionate. This is not an accusation. It is an observation about how the mind protects itself. The parts of us that are most entrenched, the patterns that have been with us longest, that were perhaps useful at some earlier point in our lives, are the parts most likely to have developed sophisticated justifications for their continued existence. The Stoic practice here is not self-flagellation. It is the patient, honest, gentle practice of asking, is this quality I am proud of actually what I think it is? Or is it something else wearing a flattering name? This question is not to torture yourself with. It is a gift. Because the patterns that run unseen, that are never questioned, that have been given virtue names, these are the patterns with the most power over you. Seeing them clearly is the beginning of choosing something different. That is truth 39. Truth 40. Freedom from outcome is not indifference to outcome. Here is a confusion that arises with Stoicism that is worth addressing directly. People sometimes hear the Stoic advice about focusing on the process rather than the outcome, and understand it to mean, don't care about outcomes, be indifferent to results. Cultivate a kind of detachment that allows nothing to matter. This is a serious misreading. The Stoics cared deeply about outcomes. Marcus Aurelius cared deeply about the health of the empire, about the welfare of its citizens, about getting things right. Seneca cared about his work, his letters, the people he wrote to. Epictetus cared about his students. The Stoics were people of profound engagement and genuine care. The distinction is between caring about outcomes and needing a specific outcome in order to maintain inner stability. You can want things, you can work hard towards specific results, you can invest fully in the attempt, and you can also simultaneously hold the outcome loosely, acknowledging that many variables are outside your control and that the meaning of your effort is not wholly dependent on whether the specific result arrives. This is not passive. It is a form of psychological resilience. The person who is only okay when things go well is at the mercy of circumstances. The person who can find meaning and integrity in the effort itself, regardless of outcome, is carrying something that circumstances cannot take. Try fully, care genuinely, work hard, and hold the result with open hands. That is truth 40. Truth 41, silence is an answer. The Stoics placed enormous value on the practice of speaking less, not as false modesty, not as a performance of wisdom, but as a genuine recognition that the quality of what comes out of your mouth depends enormously on the quality of what goes in, on the thinking, the observing, the listening that precedes speech. Marcus Aurelius wrote, "If it is not right, do not do it. If it is not true, do not say it." Simple, startlingly simple, but imagine actually living by this rule for a single day. How much of what you say falls into the category of not precisely right, not precisely true, but said anyway, not because you are dishonest, but because conversation has social rhythms and momentum, because filling silence feels polite, because the pressure to respond quickly often arrives before the thought that would actually be worth saying. The Stoics recognize silence as a form of dignity. The person who does not speak just because a space exists to be filled is the person who, when they do speak, is worth listening to. The person who waits until they have something true to say is the person whose words carry weight. There is also a practical wisdom here about conflict. Many arguments that escalate into genuine damage could have been avoided by the simplest possible action. Saying nothing in the moment when you're too angry to say anything good. The pause, the breath, the choice to not fill the silence with something that will need to be apologized for later. Silence is not weakness. Silence is often the most powerful thing available. That is truth 41. Truth 42. The future you fear is built from the past you haven't processed. Here is something that is perhaps more psychological than strictly philosophical, but the Stoics would have recognized it. The specific shape of your anxiety about the future is not random. It is drawn from the specific losses and disappointments and violations of your past. The fears are not general. They are personal. They have fingerprints. The person who fears abandonment is typically someone who experienced abandonment. The person who fears failure is typically someone for whom failure had disproportionately high consequences at a formative point. The person who fears conflict has usually learned that conflict is dangerous. This does not mean these fears are irrational. Many of them were entirely rational responses to real situations. The problem is that the nervous system, once it learns a pattern, keeps applying the pattern even when the original situation is no longer present. The danger is gone, the pattern remains. The Stoic practice of understanding the origins of your responses, of tracing the fear to its source, of asking where this pattern comes from and whether it still applies, is an act of enormous self-compassion. Because the fear that you understand is the fear you can choose how to engage with. The fear that runs unseen runs your life. You are not obligated to be governed by the past, but you need to know it first. You need to see it clearly, not with judgment, with the same gentle curiosity you would bring to understanding anyone you cared about. That is Truth 42. Truth 43. The goal is not to feel nothing. The goal is to feel without being swept away. The Stoic ideal is sometimes called apatheia, freedom from the passions. And this has been translated into the English word apathy, which is unfortunate because the translation is deeply misleading. Apatheia does not mean not feeling. It does not mean the flat, gray, disconnected state of the depressed person or the numbed person or the person who has learned to function by shutting down. It means something much more nuanced and much more difficult. It means the ability to feel fully and still maintain your equanimity, to be moved by beauty without being destroyed when the beauty passes, to be grieved by loss without being defined by the grief, to be delighted without becoming dependent on the delight. This is the emotional maturity that the Stoics spent decades cultivating, not the absence of feeling, the capacity to hold feeling with a certain spaciousness, to be with what is arising without immediately being identified as it. Think of the difference between watching a storm from inside a solid house and standing in the storm without shelter. In the house, you can watch the storm fully, you can appreciate its power, you can feel the sound of it and the drama of it, and you remain safe. The storm moves through, the house holds. The inner work of Stoicism is the building of the house, not a house that locks the storm out, a house that gives you somewhere to stand while the storm moves through. That is Truth 43. Truth 44. Your reaction tells you more about you than the event tells you about the world. There is a useful thought experiment that the Stoics employed. When you have a strong reaction, anger, fear, hurt, intense frustration, take a moment before acting on it and ask, what does this reaction tell me about what I believe? Not, is the reaction justified? Not, is the other person wrong? Those are separate questions and they have their own place. But first, what does my reaction reveal? If you're furious when someone questions your competence, what does that tell you about what you believe about your own competence? If you're devastated when a relationship ends, what does that tell you about where you placed your sense of safety? If you are racked with envy when a peer succeeds, what does that tell you about where you believe your own success is lacking? These reactions are not problems. They are information. They are, in fact, more honest information about your inner life than most of what you consciously believe about yourself, because the reaction is fast, automatic, pre-reflective. It comes from the parts of you that haven't been polished for public presentation. The Stoics were endlessly interested in this kind of honest self-observation, not to punish themselves for what they found, not to perform a better version for an imagined audience, but to actually know themselves, to close the gap between the self they presented and the self they actually were. The gap closes not by changing the presentation. It closes by honestly acknowledging what is inside and choosing gradually and with patience what to do with it. That is Truth 44. Truth 45. Acceptance is not defeat. This is perhaps the most misunderstood thing about Stoicism in popular culture. Acceptance is seen as giving up, as passivity, as the philosophical equivalent of lying down while the world walks over you. This is a fundamental misreading. What the Stoics meant by acceptance, what Marcus Aurelius practiced and Epictetus taught and Seneca described, is something much more active and much more demanding than passivity. It is the acceptance of reality as it actually is, not as you wish it were. And from that clear-eyed acceptance of what is actually here, you make the best possible choices about how to engage. The alternative, resisting reality, raging against what cannot be changed, spending your energy fighting the unchangeable, is not strength. It is a kind of madness. It is the expenditure of enormous psychological and physical resources on the project of changing what has already happened. The river is not going to flow backward. The person is not going to unsay what they have said. The loss has already occurred. The failure has already happened. These things are real and they are fixed, and no amount of anguish directed at them will unmake them. Acceptance says, this is what is here. Now what? And from the now what comes all the genuine freedom available. Because the energy that was being spent on resistance is now available for response, for the actual choices that remain in the present about who you want to be and how you want to live. Acceptance is not the end of agency. It is the beginning of it. That is truth 45. Truth 46. What other people do to you is their karma. How you respond is yours. This is a formulation the Stoics wouldn't have used. Karma is not a Stoic word, but the idea is theirs. Marcus Aurelius wrote, "The best revenge is to be unlike him who performed the injury." In other words, the person who wrongs you has made a choice about their own character. They have acted from fear or greed or cruelty or ignorance. That choice belongs to them. It reflects something about who they are. It is, in a meaningful sense, not your problem. What is your problem? What is your responsibility? Your domain, your circle, is what you do next, who you choose to be in response to what was done. Whether you allow their choice to determine your character, or whether you maintain your own. This is not easy. When someone hurts you, the body and mind want symmetry. They want to return pain for pain. The primitive logic of it is very powerful. You were wronged, therefore you deserve to right the wrong by inflicting equivalent injury. The relief of revenge feels like justice, but the Stoics observe that it is not justice, it is contamination. The person who responds to cruelty with cruelty has allowed the first cruelty to generate a second one. The person who was wronged has now done wrong. The damage has spread. The Stoic alternative is not meekness. It is not the pretense that what was done was acceptable. It is the maintenance of your own standards of behavior regardless of what the other person's standards have proven to be. It is the refusal to let someone else's worst moment define your response. That is truth 46. Truth 47. What you practice, you become. Aristotle said it before the Stoics, but the Stoics lived it. Character is not a fixed quality you are born with. It is what you build through repeated choices across time. Every time you choose patience over reaction, you become a more patient person. Not dramatically, not immediately, but the neural pathway of patience deepens slightly with each use, and the neural pathway of reaction, having been bypassed, weakens slightly, and over time, over weeks, months, years of small choices, you become gradually and genuinely the person you were choosing to be. This is very good news. It means that the version of yourself you admire, the version that is calmer and more grounded and more honest and more present, this person is not a fantasy. This person is what you're building right now with the choices available to you tonight. It also means that what you're practicing right now matters. Every hour spent in anxious scrolling is practice. Every night of going to sleep with the phone in your hand is practice. Every reaction chosen over reflection is practice. We are always practicing something. The only question is whether we are practicing what we actually want to become. The Stoics practiced daily the journaling, the reflection, the philosophy, not as intellectual hobby but as lived discipline. They understood that the ideal is not something you achieve, it is something you practice, and the practicing is the point. That is truth 47. Truth 48. Pleasure and meaning are not the same thing. The Stoics were in a conversation that ran through the whole of ancient philosophy. the conversation about what constitutes a good life. And one of the most important distinctions they made was between hedon, pleasure, and eudaimonia, flourishing, which is sometimes translated as happiness but means something deeper and less momentary. Pleasure is real, pleasure is valuable. The Stoics were not anti-pleasure in the way that some religious traditions have been. They ate good food, they enjoyed wine, they valued beauty and conversation, and the physical pleasures of a human life. Seneca, in particular, wrote warmly about friendship and fine dinners and the pleasure of good company. But they observed, and this observation is one of the most practically urgent things they offer the modern world, that pleasure alone does not produce a life that feels worth living. You can have enormous amounts of pleasure, more pleasure than any previous generation in human history, in fact, which is arguably the situation of many people in the developed world, and still feel profoundly empty, still feel like something is missing, still feel like you are living a life that doesn't quite add up to anything. The missing ingredient is not more pleasure, it is meaning, purpose, the sense that your existence contributes something, creates something, is oriented towards something beyond the accumulation of pleasant experiences. The Stoics found meaning and virtue in living according to their deepest values regardless of the external returns, in the quality of how they showed up rather than in the rewards that showed up for them. What does your life mean? Not in the grand cosmic sense, in the small daily sense. What are you building here? That is truth 48. Truth 49. Forgiveness is not for the person you're forgiving. It is for you. The Stoics were not sentimentalists about forgiveness. They did not advocate for it because it is spiritually beautiful or because it is what good people do. They advocated for it because they understood very clearly what holding on to resentment costs the person who holds it. Seneca wrote about this with characteristic directness. He described the person who carries a grudge as someone who has voluntarily made themselves a prisoner of someone else. Every day spent in resentment is a day in which the person who wronged you continues to have power over your inner life, continues to shape your experience, continues to take up residence in your mind, often without knowing they are there. The person you resent has moved on. They are eating dinner, they are sleeping, they are living their life. Your resentment is not touching them. It is only touching you. Forgiveness in the Stoic sense is not absolution. It is not the declaration that what was done was acceptable. It is not the removal of consequences or the elimination of appropriate boundaries. It is simply the decision to stop allowing what happened to continue happening inside you, to take your mind back, to refuse to give another person permanent residence in your inner life. This is not easily done. Forgiveness is sometimes the work of years, but it begins with the understanding that it is not a gift you give to the person who hurt you. It is a gift you give to yourself. That is truth 49. Truth 50, the wise person is not the one with the most answers. It is the one who keeps asking. There is a version of wisdom that the culture admires and that the Stoics would have found suspicious. The wisdom of certainty. The confidence of the person who has figured things out, who has the answers, who can offer you a clean formula for a clean life. Genuine wisdom, the kind the Stoics were after, the kind Socrates was after, the kind that actually holds up under the pressure of a real human life, looks more like the willingness to keep questioning, the comfort with not knowing. The ability to sit with contradiction and ambiguity and the genuine complexity of being alive without forcing them into a premature resolution. Marcus Aurelius in his final years was still asking the same questions he had been asking in his youth, still trying to understand how to be good, still finding that the ideals slipped away in practice, still returning to the attempt. He was not a sage who had transcended human difficulty. He was a man who had practiced engagement with human difficulty for decades and had gotten through that practice a little better at it. That is not a consolation. It is the honest shape of the thing. You will not reach a point at which all the questions are answered and the living is finally easy. But you can reach a point through the patient, honest, generous practice of examining your life, where you are genuinely comfortable not having all the answers, where the questions feel like companions rather than torturers, where the mystery of what you are and why you are here is not a wound but a wonder that is the most any philosopher has ever honestly promised, and it is in the end enough. That is Truth 50. You have now walked through 50 truths, the first 25 about slowing the mind, the last 25 about pain and the limits of control. You have been in the harder territory now, the room we usually keep locked. And if you are still here, something in you understands that the hardest truth is also the most freeing. You cannot control most of what happens to you, and you can completely control how you meet it. But there is a third territory, and it is the deepest one. Because ultimately the Stoics were not merely interested in how to endure difficulty or slow a restless mind, they were interested in stillness itself, in the quality of inner peace that is not the absence of difficulty, but the presence of something else entirely. Something that difficulty cannot reach, something that exists before the problem arrives and after it has passed. In part 3, we turn to that 25 truths for inner stillness. The Stoics called it tranquillitas animi, the tranquility of the soul. Seneca wrote a whole essay about it, and it begins with the simplest and the strangest and the most counterintuitive truth in the entire tradition. Peace begins when reaction ends. Continue when you are ready. You're still here, and that means something. Not many people sit with 3 hours of this kind of quiet. Not many people choose, at the end of a day that has already taken so much, to go deeper rather than shallower, to ask more rather than numb more. The fact that you are here, that you started part 1 in the restlessness of an unsettled evening and have moved through 50 truths and arrived at this third part, this speaks to something in you that wants what philosophy, at its best, has always offered. Not answers, not comfort exactly. Something more honest than both. Something like the company of people who took the difficulty of being alive very seriously and found in that seriousness something worth living for. The Stoics called it tranquillitas animi, the tranquility of the soul. Not the tranquility of the person who has sorted everything out, not the peace of the person with no problems, not the stillness of someone who has stopped caring, something entirely different. The tranquility of the person who is fully present, fully engaged, fully alive, and is no longer fighting the nature of things. There is a story about Epictetus that his students told. He was asked once by a visitor what the essence of his philosophy was. He thought for a moment and then he said, "Bear and forbear. Bear what is given to bear, and forbear. Hold back from reacting to what does not require reaction." The whole of Stoicism is in those 4 words, and the whole of these final 25 truths is the slow, patient unpacking of what they mean in the lived reality of a human life. Let us enter the last territory, Truth 51. Peace is not something you arrive at, it is something you return to. This distinction is subtle, but it is one of the most practically important in the entire tradition, because the model most people have of inner peace is of a destination, a place you get to, a state you achieve once you have done enough work, or resolved enough problems, or found the right person, or the right path, or the right understanding. And from within that model, every disruption feels like failure. Every difficult emotion that surfaces after a period of calm feels like a relapse. Every day when the peace is not there feels like evidence that you haven't actually found it, that you are still somehow short of where you need to be. The Stoic model is entirely different. Seneca wrote, "Withdraw into yourself as much as possible. Associate with those who will make a better man of you. Welcome those whom you yourself can improve. The process is mutual, for men learn while they teach." He was describing a process of returning. Not a single act of finding. You turn inward. You find something quiet there. The world calls you back out. You return to the world, to the life, to the engagement, and then you turn inward again. Peace is not the absence of disturbance. It is the capacity to return to yourself after disturbance, to refine the quiet center, to remember again and again what you actually are beneath the roles and the performances and the noise. You will not find peace once and keep it. You will find it, lose it, and find it again and again and again. And the finding gets a little easier each time because you have found it before and you know the way. That is truth 51. Truth 52. Virtue is its own reward, not metaphorically, literally. The Stoics made a claim that sounds almost naively optimistic when stated plainly: virtue is the only good. Nothing else, not wealth, not health, not pleasure, not reputation, is good in the full sense. These are preferred indifferents, things worth having if possible, worth pursuing within reasonable limits, but not goods in the deepest sense because they can be taken from you. Virtue, courage, wisdom, justice, temperance cannot be taken from you. It is entirely yours, and it is, the Stoics argued, its own complete reward. The virtuous action is fully satisfying in the doing, regardless of what it produces. This sounds like philosophical idealism, and there is a way to read it as such. But there is also a way to read it that is grounded in direct experience. Think of the last time you did something genuinely good, not for recognition, not for reward, not for the approval of others, something that cost you something, your time, your comfort, your ego, and that you did anyway because it was right. Think of how that felt. Not the pride, which is about the ego, the quiet underneath the pride, the simple, unadorned sense of being consistent with what you actually are. That feeling is what the Stoics meant. That quality, the inner alignment between your values and your actions, is not a means to something else. It is not instrumental. It is the thing itself, the good, the thing that makes a life feel worth living from the inside. No one else needs to know. The receipt is internal. That is truth 52. Truth 53, the mind that judges constantly is never at rest. There is a kind of mental activity that runs nearly continuously in most people, and that produces enormous fatigue while producing very little of actual value. It is the activity of judgment. The constant rating and ranking and evaluating and comparing and labeling of everything that enters the field of experience. This is good. That is bad. This person is worth respecting. That one isn't. This situation is an improvement on what came before. That one is a step backward. This feeling is acceptable. That one isn't. This version of myself is okay. That one falls short. The judging never stops. And underneath the exhaustion of a difficult day is often not the difficulty itself, but the sheer energy cost of all that judging. Marcus Aurelius wrote, "Accept the things to which fate binds you, and love the people with whom fate brings you together, and do so with all your heart." Love the people with whom fate brings you together, not judge them, not evaluate them against your standards for acceptable people, just love them in the sense of being genuinely open to them, genuinely interested in them, genuinely present for them as they actually are rather than as you wish they were. The mind that pauses its judgment, even briefly, even imperfectly, discovers something like rest, not blankness, not indifference, but a quality of receptive openness that is entirely different from the ceaseless evaluation. It is the difference between looking at something and seeing it. You can see things more clearly when you are not simultaneously grading them. That is truth 53. Truth 54. Loneliness is not the absence of people. It is the absence of self. This is one of the quieter truths in the Stoic tradition, and it is one that lands differently for different people. Some will read it and feel recognized. Others will need to sit with it for longer. Epictetus said something about solitude that inverts the common understanding of it. He said that a person who is genuinely comfortable in their own presence is never truly alone, and the person who needs constant company in order to feel okay is, in a meaningful sense, always alone, because they have not yet found the company of their own self. Loneliness is often not about the number of people around you. You can be lonely in a crowded room, in a full relationship, in a life that looks from the outside like a life full of connection. The loneliness is the gap between the self you are presenting to others and the self you actually are. When that gap is large, when you have been performing a version of yourself for so long that you have lost track of what the non-performing version is, the loneliness is profound, because there is no one there to be not lonely with. The Stoic practice of solitude was not a withdrawal from the world. It was a restoration of the self. The regular practice of being alone, of not filling the silence with noise, of allowing yourself to simply exist without performing for anyone. This was understood as the maintenance of the inner life, the thing that makes genuine connection with others possible. You cannot connect with others from a self that doesn't know itself. That is Truth 54. Truth 55. The news of the world does not require your constant attention. There is an argument that engaged citizens must stay informed, must know what is happening, must maintain awareness of the state of the world. This argument has genuine merit. Ignorance of the world has real costs. The person who pays no attention to what happens beyond their immediate life is failing in a certain civic responsibility. But this legitimate argument has been weaponized in the age of continuous information into something that does not serve anyone. The implicit demand of the attention economy is not stay informed, it is stay alarmed, stay outraged, stay engaged not with what you can actually do something about, but with the full horror of everything happening everywhere simultaneously. And the honest answer is that no human nervous system was designed for this. The nervous system that evolved to monitor the immediate environment, the village, the forest, the immediate social group, cannot process the simultaneous emotional content of a whole world in continuous crisis without cost. The Stoics would have found this self-evident. Of course, you cannot carry the weight of everything. Of course, the scope of your genuine agency is limited. Of course, the attempt to stay perpetually informed about everything, perpetually terrible, produces not engaged citizens, but exhausted, anxious, politically paralyzed people who feel terrible about the world and are too depleted to do anything about it. Choose your sphere of engagement. Know the things it is useful for you to know. Act where you can act, and protect the inner resource, the quiet mind, the capacity for clear thought, without which you cannot act effectively on anything. The world will survive your silence for one evening. That is Truth 55. Truth 56. The philosophy that does not change how you live is merely decoration. Seneca wrote this with a kind of impatience that cuts through the centuries. He wrote, "There are men who have professed philosophy not in order to be improved by it, but in order to grace their conversation with the authority of its name." He was writing about people who collected philosophical ideas the way others collect art, not to live by them, not to be changed by them, but to display them, to be seen as the kind of person who reads philosophy, to have interesting things to say at dinner. And he was merciless about this. Because for Seneca, philosophy was not ornament, it was medicine. It was the thing that could actually help with the actual problem of being a human being in a difficult world. And to use medicine as decoration is not just wasteful, it is a kind of tragedy. The measure of philosophical engagement is not how much you know, it is how you live. Whether the ideas you have encountered have actually changed anything in your choices, in your relationships, in your inner life, in how you treat the people around you. This is not a criticism, it is an invitation. Of the 55 truths we have walked through tonight, which one actually landed? Which one named something you recognized? Which one, if you were to act on it tomorrow, just one, just a small and honest beginning, would make a genuine difference to how your life feels? You do not need all 55. You need one, and you need to actually live it. The philosophy that changes nothing, changes nothing. That is truth 56. Truth 57. Your suffering has made you more available to others. This truth is not something the Stoics stated explicitly in these words, but it is something that runs through their entire tradition. It is one of the gifts hidden inside the difficulty that you wouldn't have asked for and didn't deserve. The person who has suffered, who has been through something genuinely hard, who has sat in the dark places and found their way back, this person has something that the person who has never suffered genuinely does not have. They have a map of the dark. And when someone they love finds themselves in that darkness, the map is enormously valuable. You have been changed by the difficulties you have faced, not just in the ways that are visible and acknowledged, in subtler ways, in the quality of your attention when someone tells you they are struggling, in the speed at which you arrive at patience rather than judgment, in the particular tenderness with which you hold someone who is in the place you once were. Your suffering was not punishment. It was not evidence that you are cursed or unloved by the universe. It was the making of something. Not all suffering produces this. It depends on how it is processed, how it is met, whether it is held with honesty or buried under performance. But suffering that has been honestly carried and honestly grieved produces in time a quality of human richness that nothing else produces. The hardest parts of your life have made you more human, more capable of genuine connection, more useful to the people who love you. That is truth 57. Truth 58. The self is not a fixed thing, it is a direction. The Stoics believed in something they called progress, prokope, the progressive advance toward wisdom and virtue. Not arrival, progress, the direction of movement. And this is liberating in a way that the goal of perfection is not. Because perfection is either achieved or not. It is binary, and no human being achieves philosophical perfection. Which means that if perfection is the goal, everyone fails. Always. But progress is available to everyone, every morning, regardless of yesterday. The self that you are is not a fixed object. It is not a thing that was completed at some point in the past and is now simply being expressed. It is a direction, a trajectory, something that is being shaped continuously by the choices you make and the attention you bring and the values you act from. This means that the version of yourself you admire, the version that is wiser and more grounded and more honest and more kind, this version is not separate from you waiting somewhere in the future to be found. This version is what you are building right now, with every choice available to you tonight. The question is not, am I there yet? The question is this choice taking me in the direction I actually want to go? That is truth 58. Truth 59. Wisdom recognizes its own limits. There is an intellectual humility at the core of Stoic practice that is easy to overlook, because the Stoics are often presented as people who had worked everything out, who had found the system, who could face any difficulty because they had the philosophical answer to it. But read the actual texts, and what you find is something much more honest than that. Marcus Aurelius doesn't write like someone who has figured it out. He writes like someone who is trying. Constantly, patiently, sometimes wearily trying. Returning to the same failures. Acknowledging the gap between the ideal he holds and the person he is on a given day. Seneca confessed in a letter to Lucilius that he was nowhere near the philosopher he aspired to be, that the words he wrote were far ahead of the life he actually managed to live, that he was in many important respects still a work in progress, and this admission came late in his life. This is not hypocrisy. This is the honest shape of the project. The goal is not to claim wisdom. The goal is to pursue it. And the genuine pursuit of wisdom includes the acknowledgement of how much you don't yet understand. The person who is certain they have figured out how to live, is the person who has stopped actually living long enough to examine it. The questions are always ahead of the answers. The territory is always larger than the map. Sit comfortably in not knowing. It is where the good work happens. That is truth 59, truth 60. The quality of your attention is the quality of your life. We return here near the end of this long walk to something like the first truth but seen from a greater depth. You have attention. It is limited and precious and utterly non-renewable. Every moment of it that passes is gone permanently. And the way you direct it, the quality of presence you bring to the moments of your life, this is, in the most literal possible sense, the texture of your existence. Think about the moments in your life that felt fully alive, the moments of genuine presence in connection, in nature, in work, in love, in grief, in joy. What they had in common is that you were actually there. Your attention was not split between the moment and a screen, not half present and half somewhere else. You were in the room, in the conversation, in the feeling. Those moments did not ask more of life than this. They asked more of you, more presence, more willingness to actually be where you were. The Stoics did not have smartphones. They did not live inside an attention economy. But they understood the principle, because the principle predates its modern instantiations. They understood that the scattered mind, the mind pulled in many directions, never fully anywhere, is a mind that misses its own life. You have this moment, actually, genuinely, only this moment. The past is memory and the future is imagination, and the present is the only place where life is actually occurring. Be here, not perfectly, not permanently, but as much as you can, as often as you can, in whatever way is honest for you. Be here. That is truth 60. Truth 61. Love is the highest form of attention. The Stoics are not typically celebrated as philosophers of love. They are known for discipline, for reason, for the endurance of difficulty. But read between the lines of the texts, in the warmth of Seneca's letters to Lucilius, in the tenderness of Epictetus toward his students, in the passages in Marcus Aurelius about his gratitude for the people who shaped him. And what you find is a tradition that understood love not as sentiment but as attention. To love someone is to attend to them, to actually see them, to hold their reality in your mind with genuine care and genuine curiosity, to be interested in who they actually are rather than who you need them to be. This kind of love, attentive, honest, not demanding that the other person conform to a role in your story. This is rarer than it sounds, because most of what passes for love in ordinary life is a mixture of genuine feeling and projection and need and the desire to be completed by another person. And the Stoics were suspicious of all forms of need, because need makes you vulnerable to the things outside your circle of control. But the love that is attention, the love that is genuine interest in the other, genuine care for their flourishing regardless of what they give back, this kind of love is, the Stoics would argue, the most virtuous engagement possible with another human being. It does not depend on reciprocation to be whole. It gives because giving is what love does. The person you love most deserves your full attention, not your distracted, half-air presence, your actual, genuine, available self. That is truth 61. Truth 62. The city of the soul has gates. You decide who enters. Epictetus used an image that is simple and powerful. He described the rational mind as a kind of inner fortress, not impregnable. The world can throw what it throws at the walls, but with gates. And the gates have a gatekeeper, and the gatekeeper is you. What do you let in? Which voices do you give authority over your inner life? Whose opinion genuinely deserves to influence how you see yourself? What content, what media, what conversations, what relationships are you actively inviting into the interior space where you live? This is not about building walls, not about closing yourself off from the world. It is about the recognition that the interior life is not a passive receptacle for whatever the outside world wants to put there. It has a will. It has preferences. It has standards. You are allowed to decide that certain voices, particularly the loud, cruel, contemptuous voices, whether they come from outside or from inside your own head, are not welcome. Not because you're fragile, because you're discerning. You are allowed to turn off the noise. You are allowed to choose quiet. You are allowed to decide that tonight the gate is closed to everything that would disturb the peace you are building. That is Truth 62. Truth 63. Gratitude for difficulty is the advanced practice. We spoke about gratitude in part 1. The daily, deliberate practice of noticing what is here that did not have to be here. That was the foundational practice. The advanced practice is something that sounds almost perverse when you first encounter it. It is the practice of gratitude not just for the good things, but for the difficult things, for the losses that taught you what you truly valued, for the failures that redirected you towards something more honest, for the people who challenged you in ways that ultimately made you stronger, for the limitations that forced you toward depth rather than surface. Marcus Aurelius wrote, and this is one of the most striking passages in the Meditations, that he was grateful for his difficult emperor, Hadrian, who had been a complex and sometimes cruel man, for teaching him endurance. Grateful for certain teachers who had frustrated him and disappointed him, for making him more honest with himself about what he actually believed. This is not the performance of toxic positivity. It is not the demand that you be grateful for abuse or injustice or genuine cruelty. It is the recognition that the texture of a human life, the actual richness of it, the depth of character that develops in it, comes as much from difficulty as from ease, and that when you can honestly see the value in what was hard, something in you releases, not because the hard thing was good, because you found something good in how you met it. That is Truth 63. Truth 64. The present moment always will have been. This is a truth that is almost too philosophical to land cleanly on first contact, so let us slow into it carefully. Marcus Aurelius observed in his characteristic way that time is a river of vanishing moments, that each moment as soon as it arrives is immediately receding into the past, that the future is always becoming the present, which is always becoming the past, with extraordinary speed. And the awareness of this, the genuine visceral sense that this moment is passing as you experience it, can be felt as either terrifying or liberating, depending on your relationship with the present. But there is something in this truth that the Stoics found deeply stabilizing, because it means this moment right now, whatever it is, however ordinary or difficult or beautiful, this moment is being woven permanently into the fabric of what has existed. It will always have happened. It is irrevocable. That sounds like a small thing. But think about it from the inside. The moment of genuine connection you had with someone you love, it happened. Nothing can unhappen it. The small act of integrity you performed when no one was watching, it happened. The moment of beauty you noticed, the thing you understood, the choice you made well, these exist now permanently in the unchangeable record of what has been. This evening, whatever has been good in it, a thought that landed, a moment of genuine quiet, a small recognition, this will always have been, live accordingly. That is Truth 64. Truth 65. Inner freedom is the only freedom that cannot be taken. We have arrived, near the end of this third part, at something that the Stoics considered the heart of everything, the thing that all the discipline and all the practice and all the philosophy was ultimately pointing toward. Epictetus was a slave. He owned nothing. He had no freedom of movement, no freedom of occupation, no freedom of association in any formal sense. And yet he described himself, in his philosophy, as the freest man alive. This was not delusion. It was not the coping mechanism of a broken man making peace with an impossible situation. It was a genuine philosophical claim that the only freedom worth having is the one that cannot be taken. The freedom of the inner life. the freedom to choose how to meet what arrives, the freedom to maintain integrity regardless of external coercion, the freedom to think clearly and observe honestly and hold your own counsel in a world that is constantly trying to do your thinking for you. External freedom is real and valuable and worth fighting for. The Stoics did not advocate for slavery. They were describing what was available even when external freedom was absent. They were, in a sense, describing the floor, the minimum of human freedom that exists regardless of circumstances. And if that floor is available in slavery, in the most absolute form of external constraint imaginable, then it is available to you tonight, in whatever situation you find yourself, in whatever form your constraints take. You are free right now in the only way that is never taken. The inner life is yours, completely, permanently, unassailably. No one can take it. That is Truth 65. Truth 66. To live well, you need very little. This truth is near the end of this journey for a reason. It is one of those truths that can only really be heard after a long walk, after the simpler reassurances have been offered and received, and the harder ground has been covered, because it sounds on first reading like an invitation to poverty or an argument against ambition. And it is neither. It is something more precise. Seneca wrote, "It is not the man who has too little, but the man who craves more who is poor." To live well, to have a life that feels meaningful, that is rich with genuine connection and honest work, and the daily practice of being the person you actually want to be, this requires, in material terms, very little. Not nothing, not deprivation, but very little. What it requires in interior terms is more demanding. It requires honesty, the willingness to see yourself and your life clearly. It requires attention, the capacity to actually be present for what is happening rather than always somewhere else. It requires the daily practice of returning to what you value, acting from it, and adjusting when you drift. These things are not purchased. They are not given. They are not the reward of achievement or the prize of status. They are available right now, in the life you have, with the resources you already possess, in the circumstances that are actually here. The life you are looking for is not somewhere ahead of you. It is here, in how you engage with what is already present. That is Truth 66. Truth 67. The courage to be yourself is the final courage. We live in a time of extraordinary pressure toward conformity. Not the old kinds of conformity, not the pressure to dress the same or worship the same, but a subtler, more pervasive pressure to perform a particular kind of success, a particular kind of happiness, a particular kind of self that is legible to others and acceptable to the cultural marketplace of images. And behind many of the anxieties that drive people to philosophy, the restlessness, the feeling of missing something, the hollow sensation of a life that looks right from the outside and feels wrong from the inside is this: the gap between who you are performing and who you actually are. The Stoics asked again and again a question that cuts through all the noise. What do you actually believe? Not what you have been told to believe, not what would be socially acceptable to believe. What do you, in the actual interior of your actual self, genuinely hold to be true? And then, is your life consistent with it? The courage to be yourself, to live from your actual values rather than performed ones, to pursue what genuinely matters to you rather than what impresses others, to be honest in your relationships even when honesty is uncomfortable, to admit what you don't know, to acknowledge what you do wrong, to be present without armor. This is the final courage, the hardest one, the one that all the other disciplines are preparation for. It requires everything the Stoics have been teaching: the discipline of the inner life, the acceptance of what you cannot control, the return to yourself after disturbance, the willingness to be seen as you actually are rather than as you wish to be perceived. But on the other side of that courage is something the Stoics called eudaimonia, not happiness in the shallow sense. Flourishing, the the particular quality of a life that is being lived honestly from the inside out. That is Truth 67. Truth 68. Death teaches us how to live. Marcus Aurelius meditated on death not because he was morbid or desperate, but because he had understood something that most people spend great effort avoiding, that the awareness of death is one of the most clarifying forces available to a human life. When you genuinely remember that you will die, not as a vague abstract fact, but as a real personal embodied understanding, certain things that seemed urgent become trivial. Certain things that seemed optional become urgent. The pettiness of old resentments becomes visible. The value of the people you love becomes luminous. The memento mori practice of the Stoics was not dark. It was a form of gratitude, a way of not sleepwalking through the finite time available. A way of ensuring that when the last day comes, and it will come for all of us sooner or later, there is not the particular grief of having been present for very little of it. You will not be here forever. Neither will the people you love. Neither will this evening, which is already passing, which is already on its way to becoming memory. The awareness of this does not have to be terrifying. It can be, if you let it, liberating. It can be the thing that wakes you up tonight to the fact that what is here is worth being present for. This moment, this breath, this quiet, this life. It is here now. That is Truth 68. Truth 69, the world does not owe you ease. This truth is not harsh, though it sounds harsh on first reading. It is one of the most freeing things the Stoics understood. We are raised in many modern contexts with a set of implicit promises about how life will go. Work hard and you will be rewarded. Be good and good things will happen to you. Follow the rules and you will be protected. These promises are not true, and the discovery that they are not true through the first major failure, the first unfair loss, the first genuine injustice that you cannot undo. This discovery is often the most painful thing that happens to a person in early adulthood. The Stoics would have saved considerable time. They would have said, the world is not organized around your welfare. It is not designed to reward virtue or punish vice. It does not operate on the terms of human fairness. It operates on its own terms, which are impersonal, which are often brutal, which do not take into account whether you deserved what you received. This is not despair. It is liberation. Because once you stop expecting the world to be fair, once you actually, genuinely, emotionally absorb the truth that you are not owed ease and that difficulty is not evidence of failure or punishment, something loosens. The suffering caused by the unfairness stops. You are still in the difficulty, but you have stopped fighting the extra battle, the meta battle of arguing with reality about whether the difficulty should be there. It is here. It is not personal. It is not evidence against you. Now what will you make of it? That is Truth 69, Truth 70. Wherever you are is where the work is. Seneca wrote a letter to Lucilius about travel. His friend had apparently suggested that a change of scene might help with his melancholy, that going somewhere new might offer relief from his restlessness. And Seneca responded with characteristic directness, "You are sky blue and yet the same. You change the place, but not the soul. Recede in te ipse. Retreat into yourself was his prescription, not a change of location, a change of attention." The people who move to escape themselves are familiar figures who change jobs to escape the feeling that something is missing, who change cities, change relationships, change circumstances, looking for the version of their life that finally feels right, and find each time that the feeling followed them, because the feeling is not in the location. It is in the relationship between the self and the present moment, and that relationship travels with you. It is the one thing you cannot leave behind, the work. The real, deep, long work of becoming the person you actually want to be is available wherever you are, in the circumstances you are actually in, with the resources you actually have, with the people who are actually present in your life, not in the better version of your circumstances that is coming later if everything goes right here now with this. That is truth 70. Truth 71. The examined relationship is the most enduring one. The Stoics were interested in friendship in a particular way. They distinguished between friendships of utility, people you associate with because they are useful to you, friendships of pleasure, people whose company you enjoy, and friendships of virtue, people you love because you genuinely admire who they are and they challenge you to become better. The third kind was rare. They acknowledged, truly rare, because it requires both parties to be engaged in the kind of honest self-examination that most people avoid, to be willing to be known accurately, which means being willing to be seen in your difficulty and your failure and your inconsistency, not just in your best moments. But the third kind of friendship is also the most enduring and the most nourishing, because it is not contingent on usefulness or on the maintenance of pleasant feeling. It is rooted in something that weathers the mutual, genuine care for each other's character. The examined relationship, the one where you can be honest about your struggles, where the other person can say the difficult, true thing and be heard rather than resented, where you are genuinely interested in each other's growth rather than in each other's validation. This relationship is worth more than almost anything else available in a human life, and it begins with your own willingness to be examined, to allow yourself to be known, to stop performing and start being. That is truth 71. Truth 72. The wise person lives as if today were sufficient, not as if today were the last day. The Stoics were careful about this distinction. The last day framing produces a kind of urgency that can distort, burning bridges, making dramatic gestures, treating the ordinary as insufficient. The sufficient day framing is different. It says what I have today, the people I have access to, the work available to me, the time and the health and the attention I currently possess. This is enough to live a genuinely good day. I do not need it to be more than this. I do not need it to be better, more dramatic, more significant. I can live well today with what is actually here. This requires a kind of courage, because the mind that is always elsewhere, always in the future where things will be better, or in the past where things were worse or better or different, this mind does not have to fully arrive. It can always tell itself that the real living begins when conditions improve. To say today is sufficient is to commit, to actually show up, to put your whole self into the day that is here rather than saving your whole self for the day that is coming. This is what Marcus Aurelius meant by confine yourself to the present, not constrict yourself. Commit yourself. Be here genuinely and fully for this. That is truth 72. Truth 73. The quiet life is not a lesser life. The culture celebrates the loud life, the ambitious, the visible, the dramatically successful, the person who is known, who is seen, who leaves a large mark on a large stage. And there is nothing wrong with this in itself. Some people are genuinely called to large stages and occupy them with grace and do real good from there. But there is an enormous amount of quiet life that is not celebrated and is not lesser for being quiet. Marcus Aurelius never intended his meditations to be published. He was writing for himself, in private, in the margins of a life spent on a very public stage, where everything he did was watched and commented on and judged. And the private writing, the honest, searching, humble private writing is what has lasted. Not the public victories, not the military campaigns, the private conversation with himself, the person who raises children well and is known by very few, the craftsman whose work is excellent and whose name is unknown, the teacher who shapes lives without ever being recognized for it, the friend who shows up reliably in the small crises that don't make dramatic stories. These people are living large lives. They are just living them quietly. You are allowed to want a quiet life. You are allowed to find the smallness of it sufficient. You are allowed to do your good work in a room with no audience. The tree that roots deeply and grows slowly is not the lesser tree. That is truth 73. Truth 74. Equanimity is not a mood, it is a posture. We are very close now to the end. And this truth is near the end because it is the summary of everything the Stoics were working toward. All the discipline, all the reflection, all the philosophy, it was in service of this equanimity, the tranquillitas animi that Seneca wrote about. The inner stillness that is not the absence of feeling, but the capacity to be with feeling without being defined by it. The Stoics knew that they could not prevent life from being difficult. They could not prevent loss or failure, or the endless unpredictability of existence in a world that does not organize itself around human preferences. What they could build through practice, through philosophy, through the patient tending of the inner life was a posture toward all of it that held, not rigidity, not the posture of the person who refuses to be moved, but the posture of the person who can be moved, who feels fully, who is genuinely engaged with what is happening, and who returns after each disturbance to something quiet inside themselves that is not disturbed. This is not achieved, it is practiced. Epictetus did not wake up one morning fully equanimous. Marcus Aurelius did not stop struggling. They practiced daily the return, the orientation, the small patient acts of choosing attention over reaction, presence over avoidance, honesty over comfortable self-deception. And over years, the practice changed the posture. The return got a little easier, the equilibrium became a little more accessible, not perfectly, not permanently, but reliably, tenderly. Truly, that is what is available. That is truth 74, truth 75. You are already in this moment enough. We have walked a very long way tonight, through 50 truths about slowing the mind, through 25 truths about pain and control. And now to this final truth, which is the quietest and perhaps the most difficult to receive, not because it requires more of you, but because it asks you to stop requiring more of yourself for just a moment, to put down the project of becoming and simply be. You are right now in this moment a complete human being, not a partial one waiting for completion, not a project awaiting its final stage, a complete, whole, present human being with all of your complexity and inconsistency and struggle and beauty. The Stoics would not have said this in these words. They were focused on progress, on virtue, on the ongoing work of becoming. But underneath the work, running through the whole tradition like a quiet river, is this. The work is worth doing because the person doing it is worth the work, because you matter, because the life you are living, however ordinary it appears from the outside, is a real and genuine and unrepeatable human life. You have spent this evening in the company of Seneca and Marcus Aurelius and Epictetus, people who lived more than 2,000 years ago, who suffered genuinely hard things, who asked the questions you're asking tonight, who found in the patient, honest examination of their own inner lives something that held, something that was enough. Not everything they wanted, not the absence of difficulty, but enough. And if you take only one thing from this long, slow walk, if one truth from the 75 lands and stays and becomes part of how you move through the days ahead, let it be this. You do not need to have everything figured out in order to begin living well. You do not need to be at peace in order to move toward peace. You do not need to be healed in order to start healing. You do not need to be finished in order to begin. Begin tonight with what you have, in the life that is actually yours, in the quiet of this particular hour, which will not come again, which is already passing, which is right now enough. The Stoics did not promise ease, they promised something better. They promised that the inner life, tended honestly, examined regularly, lived from with integrity, will hold, that it will prove more durable than what is taken from you, and more nourishing than what is given to you. That the person who has done the inner work will face the outer difficulty with something that functions very much like grace. Not because they feel no fear, but because they have learned that fear is not the last word. Not because they feel no grief, but because they have learned that grief is not defeat. Not because they have no questions, but because they have learned to love the questions. Marcus Aurelius ended his days as he had lived them, imperfectly, honestly, in the continuous practice of trying to be the person he believed it was worth being. He wrote in his last years not with the confidence of a sage who had arrived, but with the quiet persistence of a man who had found the practice worth keeping. He wrote, "Nowhere can man find a quieter or more untroubled retreat than in his own soul. Not in a different city, not in different circumstances, not in a better version of the life that is coming. In the soul, in the inner life, in the practiced quiet of a person who has learned slowly and imperfectly and repeatedly to come home to themselves. Tonight you have sat with 75 truths. You have moved through the restlessness of the mind and the weight of pain and the question of what stillness actually is. And now the hour is late and the mind is perhaps a little quieter, not silent, not resolved, but perhaps a little less turbulent than when you started. That is enough. The work does not end tonight. It continues tomorrow and the day after, and in all the ordinary mornings yet to come. But tonight it has begun, or it has deepened, or it has been remembered after a period of forgetting. And this, the remembering, the returning, the choosing again to do the inner work, this is what the Stoics would have called living. Not the absence of difficulty, the presence of yourself in the difficulty and beyond it, and always returning. The Mediterranean at night, if you close your eyes and let the words slow down into image, the Mediterranean at night is very dark and very still and very old. The same stars that Marcus Aurelius saw from his military tent are there above it. The same questions he asked in the dark of his private pages are still turning in the minds of people who cannot sleep. 2,000 years of humans lying awake with the same restlessness, the same longing, the same hunger for something that holds, and the same answer, quiet and patient, waiting in the inner life of whoever is still enough to hear it. Be here, be honest, be gentle with yourself, do the work, and trust that the inner life tended carefully, honestly, lovingly will be enough. It always has been. It is. The night is quiet now, and you are here, and that is everything.